11. But now coming up, we have 2 live hearings that you're going to be able to see, one on C-SPAN, one on C-SPAN 2. Let me first tell you about the one on the right that will be on C-SPAN 2. It's the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, which is chaired by Senator McCain, and the ranking member is Senator Ernest Hollings of South Carolina. The witnesses will be Governor Kane and former Congressman Lee Hamilton. They'll be testifying about the 9/11 Commission's recommendation regarding transportation security. Again, that will be on C-SPAN 2 beginning in just a few moments, and that is on the right-hand side of your screen. On the left-hand side of your screen is the committee hearing that you're going to see right now on C-SPAN. It is the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee, which is chaired by Senator Susan Collins, a Republican of Maine. The ranking member is Senator Joe Lieberman, a Democrat of Connecticut. The witnesses will be former director of the FBI and the DCI, or the Central Intelligence Agency, William Webster. Also, former DCI Chiefs James Woolsey and Stansfield Turner. You can see them there on your screen on the left-hand side. They will be the witnesses there. That hearing will begin in just a few moments. Again, the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee live on C-SPAN 1, and over on C-SPAN 2, the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee.
I think they're all good. One, Jim. See if she got my stuff.
The committee will come to order. I want to welcome not only our witnesses today and the members of the Governmental Affairs Committee who have rearranged their schedules to be here, which I very much appreciate in light of the urgency of our task. But I also want to recognize that we're joined today by the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the distinguished senator from Kansas, Senator Roberts, and that we expect shortly the ranking member of that committee, Senator Rockefeller, to also join us. I felt that since the Senate Intelligence Committee has so much expertise in this area, and we're hearing from 3 former directors of the CIA, that it would be appropriate for the chairman and the ranking member of that committee to join us today. And I'm very pleased that they have done so, and we welcome you, Senator Roberts.
Thank you.
Today, the Governmental Affairs Committee holds its 3rd hearing on the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission calling for a restructuring of the intelligence community. At our last hearing on August 3rd, we explored the National Counterterrorism Center proposal. The testimony that we heard from experienced intelligence officers and from key commission staff will help us greatly on that component of our task. Today, we will focus upon the proposal for a National Intelligence Director. No other component of the Commission's recommendations has received as much comment and debate as the proposed National Intelligence Director. There is considerable, but by no means unanimous, support for the notion that putting in place a National Intelligence Director will help strengthen our intelligence system. There is a considerable range of opinion, however, about the details of that position, including how it should be structured, where the director should work, and what authority this individual should have. It is the task of this committee to draft legislation that would ensure that the NIDs of today and for years to come have sufficient authority to do the job effectively, while at the same time being subject to the restraints necessary, the oversight and accountability, to keep the position within the bounds of our constitutional system of checks and balances. In other words, we want to create a position with real, not just symbolic authority, yet not impose just another layer of bureaucracy, nor grant so much power that we open the door to abuse. The details that we must fill in are many, and they have generated vigorous debate, as they should. These are among the questions we will ask. What powers does this new position need to be effective against the threat we face today and the threats we will face in the future? What safeguards should be included to ensure the independence of the National Intelligence Director? For example, where should this new office be located? Should the NID serve a fixed term, as does the FBI director, or serve at the pleasure of the president? Should the director have deputies that are responsible for leading intelligence efforts elsewhere in government, including some who would answer not only to the director, but also to a cabinet secretary, the so-called double-hatting question? From where will this new office get the top-notch staff that it needs? And perhaps most important, precisely what authority should the NID have over the entire intelligence community in terms of budget, personnel, technology standards, and the allocation of resources? The expertise and the insight of our distinguished witnesses today will help us in the difficult challenge of answering these questions wisely. Our witness panel brings together 3 former directors of Central Intelligence from 3 different administrations. Their service spanned nearly 3 decades and witnessed an incredible variety of issues. They will provide us with the perspective of those who have grappled with the challenges facing our intelligence community while serving at the highest level. In addition, former CIA Director Robert Gates has submitted a very thoughtful written statement since he is unable to be with us today. Judge Webster, Mr. Woolsey, Admiral Turner, we're very pleased that you've taken the time to be with us today, and we look forward to hearing your testimony shortly. I'd now like to call on the ranking member, my partner in this endeavor, Senator Lieberman.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I join you in welcoming Senator Roberts and Senator Rockefeller to our committee, and I thank the 3 witnesses today. It wouldn't be stretching even senatorial hyperbole to say that these are 3 wise men. They have served our country well and continue to do so in many capacities, and I say so even knowing from advanced text that they don't share exactly my reaction to all of the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. The report of the September 11th Commission represents an indictment of the status quo in our intelligence community, and in doing so links the shortcomings the Commission has found directly to the horrific events of September 11th. In my own reaction, I found the Commission report so convincing that I would say, not that my mind is totally made up, but that I would put the burden of proof on those who would argue with the major recommendations of the Commission. Madam Chairman, I thank you again for the pace that this committee is setting in the consideration of the Commission report. We operate in a time of crisis. The specific ongoing information that we not only receive in classified briefings, but that the public receives in news announcements about continuing terrorist threats just reminds us about how urgent it is that we act. Now, of course, we don't want to act so quickly that we do something wrong. But the issues that the Commission has framed are clear, and they're not uncomplicated. But the sooner we face them and thrash them out and hear opposing points of view, the sooner we're going to be able to act wisely. And I think the pace that the committee has set, and now that other committees have set, now joined by the leaders of the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, is a very a very hopeful sign. This hearing focuses on the National Intelligence Director. Chairman Kane, Vice Chairman Hamilton before us said that they felt that of the 41 recommendations of the Commission, 3 were paramount. One was the one we're talking about today, the NID. Second was the creation of the National Counterterrorism Centers. Third is the congressional reform of our oversight. So we're focused on one of the top 3 here today. In the President's announcement on this question a while back, it was not clear to me, in fact it was too clear, and I thought in what Andy Card said afterward, that the President did not have in mind a strong National Intelligence Director, particularly with regard to budget authority. In statements made last week by National Security Advisor Rice and in at least one of the newspapers that I read this morning by Commission Member John Lehman, who apparently has been speaking to the White House, there's some reason to believe that the White House may be prepared to clarify its position in the direction of a National Intelligence Director with stronger authority, particularly over the budget. If that's true, it is, in my opinion, a good development. I hope it's true, and I welcome it. But most of all, I look forward to a very open, informed, and beneficial exchange of ideas with these 3 witnesses who I thank, along with Bob Gates, for submitting the statement, for being with us this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Roberts, we're very pleased to have you here with us today, and I'd invite you to make any opening comments that you would like to make.
I'll be happy to, Madam Chairman, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for having our 3 witnesses here. I wish to thank you all for your service to our country, for your dedication, for taking time out of your very valuable schedule to come and testify before us on such an important matter. The Honorable R. James Woolsey has already testified before our committee earlier and gave excellent testimony. I want to thank also Senator Lieberman, your ranking member, for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. Senator Rockefeller and I have been very busy over the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks with our 22 professional staff members to try to come up with something that makes sense. Additionally, I want to thank you, Madam Chairman, for your leadership in this very crucial challenge and task as we work together to try to implement the goals of the 9/11 Commission. And I want to say a word about Senator Lieberman. It was Senator Coates, the former senator from Indiana, Senator Lieberman, who formed up an outfit, a subcommittee, if you will, under the Armed Services Committee, calling the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee. Now, not too many people know about that, but that subcommittee did warn clear back in 98 and 99 of a tragedy very similar to what happened in regards to 9/11. And it was the foresight in regards to Senator Lieberman that led to the formation of that subcommittee. He was a valuable member of that subcommittee, and I want to thank him for that. And I note with interest we have Senator Durbin, who is a very valuable member of our committee, and Senator Levin, who is also a member of the Intelligence Committee. So we have some very good cross-referencing here in terms of advice and counsel. Let me begin by saying that Chairman Collins has invited the Senate Committee on Intelligence to provide input to this committee's work, and we will provide a draft, Madam Chairman, a draft bill, if you will, for your consideration as of this week. We are also working with the 9/11 Commission in that respect. I'm referring to Mr. Zellico. We're working with the administration. Senator Lieberman indicated that the administration is moving in a direction that I think most members of the Senate would appreciate and would think would be positive. We are, in the doing of this, we are doing it in terms of advice and counsel and suggestions, hopefully worthy of your consideration. We're not sitting still, we meaning the Congress. I know of at least 7 hearings that have been conducted, possibly 8, 13 more prior to the Congress starting back in September. And so we are taking this very, very seriously. That draft bill that we are working with, that Senator Rockefeller and I are working on, is guided on is guided by the 9/11 Commission's report, which obviously contains some very important recommendations. Translating those important ideas, some of which are long overdue, into legislative language, however, is very complicated. As they say, why the devil is in the details. In addition to the 9/11 Commission's report and also the recommendations, the draft bill that will be provided to you is also the result of the discussion and debate over intelligence reform that has gone on over the last several decades. The products of that debate include the recent report of the Senate Committee on Intelligence's U.S. intelligence community's pre-war assessments in regard to Iraq. Now, I don't think even the members of the committee who are here today that have the privilege of serving on the Senate Intelligence Committee could have ever predicted that despite our very strong feelings and our differences, that we would end up with a 17-0 vote in favor of a report that's 511 pages long, 22 of our professional staffers, and an interview of over 240 analysts. And we made about 9 major recommendations, and it was bipartisan. As I said, it was a 17-0 vote. Those recommendations cried out for reform, and they are commensurate with the 9/11 Commission's report. And now we have turned that report over to Senator McCain, former Senator Robb, and also Mr. Silverman for further action. It also includes the many legislative proposals such as Senator Feinstein's bill and the bill introduced by Jane Harman over on the House side, and the many commissions and investigations and studies that have been convened over the years. I'm talking about the Bremer Commission, the Gilmore Commission, the CSIS study, and also the Hart-Rudman Commission. The draft bill that will be provided to this committee does provide for a national intelligence director, or what we now call the NID. That is empowered. That person would be empowered with the authorities to really lead the intelligence community as proposed in the 9/11 Commission's recommendations. Those authorities include the ability to hire and fire, as well as the ability to exercise control over the budgets of those agencies. As Congress does move toward legislating the so-called intelligence reform, guided by the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission report and many of the other various proposals for change, Senator Rockefeller and I will keep in mind that we should first do no harm and avoid as best we can the law of unintended consequences. Now, for example, one of the key issues to be resolved is how much control the NID should have over the Department of Defense intelligence estimates. There have been 10 or 11 attempts dating back to the 1940s to allegedly reform the intelligence community. In each and every case where we bumped into a real problem or a hurdle we couldn't jump, it has been in regards to the jurisdiction of the Pentagon and the Defense Department. I'm not trying to perjure them by any means. They have many fine programs, and they have programs that should not be damaged in any way. There are many good things about the way the Department of Defense does conduct its intelligence operations that we must ensure are not undermined by the reform process. I want to give you an example. Take, for example, a Special Forces team that is supported by a military intelligence analyst. If that team is operating on the field of battle in Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom, it seems very clear to me that the team's intelligence specialist is a tactical asset that needs to be controlled by the local military chain of command. And the NID, or the National Intelligence Director, probably doesn't want or need to become involved. But move that same team to Afghanistan, outside the no man's land where Osama bin Laden is hiding, and I would argue the team's intelligence specialist then has become a strategic national asset that may require the support and the leadership of the NID. Now, that line between the tactical and the strategic military operations gets blurred more and more every day, and it complicates the job of trying to define the NID's authorities. I am confident that you will find, however, that the draft bill that we will provide to this committee does contain some very innovative ways of addressing that problem. Sadly, many of the intelligence community problems described in the 9/11 Commission's report are not unique. The Senate Intelligence Committee's report on pre-war intelligence assessments in regard to Iraq also describes major problems in the intelligence community. The need for significant change is clear, but Congress should focus its efforts on fixing clearly identified problems in our intelligence community and not simply legislate change merely for the sake of change. As we consider reform of the intelligence community, I feel strongly we must also ensure that we institutionalize change as a continuous process in the intelligence community. I don't think we can make the mistake of rearranging the organizational chart to meet the current threat and simply stop there. Rather, we must leave in place a system that will continue to adapt to the new threats that we'll face in our nation. International terrorism is a serious threat to us and our allies, but I am confident it will not be the last threat that this nation faces. Even today, we can see in the headlines and in the intelligence reports that nations like Iran and like North Korea do continue to work very busily on their weapons of mass destruction programs. So I am hopeful that a national intelligence director will be able to focus more on running the entire intelligence community, and thus will be able to spend more time ensuring that the intelligence community does continue to adapt to our future threats. Otherwise, it will fall again to Congress to conduct yet another attempt at reform. So I thank you, Madam Chairman, for the opportunity to speak. I apologize for the length of my statement, and I do want to thank my dear colleague and friend, Senator Rockefeller, for his help, his advice, and his leadership. We both share the same goals. We've been very busy here the last 2 or 3 weeks with our professional staffers, and we should have that legislative draft to you at least by Wednesday.
Thank you. Senator Rockefeller, we're very happy to have you join us today, and I would call on you for any comments you might wish to make.
Thank you, Chairwoman Collins and Ranking Member Lieberman. You're very nice to do this. You were given the authority of putting forward legislation, and as I explained to both of you in phone conversations we had, we want to be helpful and supportive. There's some cross-jurisdictional matters with the Intelligence Committee, which we have to take very seriously. But I'm very happy that you're doing it. This is not a work of turf. This is a work of national necessity. I find myself in agreement with most of the recommendations of the Commission. Some I have some questions about. Some I think need to be explained a little bit further before I would, quote, render a judgment, at least on my part. If the Congress and the President can't reach a successful agreement and constructive reform this year, and I don't preclude a post-election session, we certainly will have failed the American people. It'll take, I think, sort of the basic question that we all face in Washington, but somehow we all continue to tread along our separate ways, and that is, what is it that makes it so difficult for the federal bureaucracy and for the United States Congress to, in fact, do what is in the national interest first, and then think about what the effect is upon their particular committee or their particular agency second? It's kind of a basic civics lesson, and one that we've never learned very well, because it in a sense, it kind of defines who we are and defines who they are. And when you compare that to the national, the fact that we're going to be dealing with this crisis on terrorism for the next 20 or 30 years or more, depending upon when we can get some kind of a message of calm and reconciliation out to the Islamic community across the world, not just the Arab world, we really do have to take this and do it correctly. If we did this by the end of the year, and everybody wants to do that, and I do too, by the end of this particular session, if we can do that, great. I don't think any of us should be under the illusions that it would have stopped the long time in place planning on the part of al-Qaeda to do what it did on 9/11, or what it may yet do if one reads the intelligence and looks at the reports. But still, that isn't that's not the question. Maybe it should be stated this way: what future failures could we avoid, and how many lives could we save because we act relatively sooner and create a mindset change in the Congress and in the bureaucracy, and particularly, of course, within our intelligence community. Nobody would disagree with the fact that we've got a 57-year-old model. It's blueprints drawn up from the Cold War. It's not an ideal arrangement for attacking an enemy that doesn't wear a uniform, an enemy that exists outside the rule of international law, international obligations, and an enemy which looks forward to slaughtering men, women, and children where they live and where they work, and does so with a religious purpose, mixed in with a hateful purpose. So the threat to our changes, to our country has obviously changed in the last decade. The intelligence community has evolved to be sure to meet that challenge, but the pace has been slow, and the question now isn't, is the pace has to be organizationally and in terms of trained people, which takes a long time, 5 years to train an analyst, 10 years to train an analyst, 5 years to train a linguist. I mean, we're talking, if we'd start now, some fairly long-term results in order to fight the global war on terrorism, which, as I indicated, I think is with us for a long time. Now, the biggest impediment is that no single person, and Chairman Roberts and everybody else has pointed this out, no person has the responsibility and the budgetary and personnel authority in hands for managing the entire intelligence community. That's a very serious error, in my point. The Director of Central Intelligence has this titular responsibility, but not the control of the budgetary strings. I asked George Tenet once if you felt like you needed to direct the intelligence community, would you? And he said, no, I'll only direct what I have budget authority over. And he said that publicly, and he said that privately, and I think that sums it up very well. As we know, it's the Secretary of Defense who controls the lion's share of the intelligence budget, and that's going to be the great battle around here. And it's one which has already joined, and again, national interest versus committee interest versus institutional interest, all of these things I think are come into play there. Where else in government or corporate America would you find such a split arrangement as we have now? It's more akin to a custody settlement between divorced parents than a management plan for a 15-agency, multi-billion-dollar entity called the intelligence community. The President's decision, as has been indicated by Senator Lieberman, to endorse the Commission recommendation to create a National Intelligence Director was a step in the right direction. His decision to deviate from the Commission's recommendation to give this director real budget and personal authority was a bigger step, in my mind, backwards. And now worrying about how to make it stronger isn't convincing to me until I see a real switch and a real willingness to invest authority in the National Intelligence Director for budget and for personnel and the rest of it. So we're going to have to break some china around here. Otherwise, we will fail. We will fail. We will do it little bits and pieces, and we will be like Congress has so often been. The American people need real reform. They want our intelligence system to be effectively managed, and for that person and those who serve under him or her to be accountable, which is a Carl Levin favorite. Accountability is a major, major factor that we're going to have to deal with. Reforming the intelligence community is about protecting American soil and American lives, but it's also about, should not be about protecting the turf at the Pentagon or at any of the intelligence agencies. This is about what is best for America, regardless of the players or the agencies. I call upon the President to endorse this essential element of the 9/11 Commission's plan so we can get about the business of reaching agreement. Chairwoman Collins and Ranking Member Lieberman, I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your statement. It's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel today. And I apologize for being distracted by the chairman of the committee.
I've been having that experience with Senator Roberts for years now.
It's a new one for me.
That's my job description.
It is a great pleasure to introduce today's distinguished witnesses. In addition to each serving as Director of Central Intelligence, each of them has served our country with honor in such fields as the judiciary, law enforcement, diplomacy, and the military. The views that they offer from the inside perspective and from many different perspectives will greatly assist this committee. William Webster was Director of Central Intelligence from 1987 to 1991, following 9 years as Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His experience in heading both the CIA and the FBI gives him a unique perspective to help us answer many of the questions today. Earlier, he served as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. Judge Webster has received numerous awards for public service, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and we welcome you. James Woolsey has served under 4 presidents, most recently as Director of Central Intelligence from 1993 to 1995. He also served as Ambassador to the Negotiation on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe from 1989 to 1991, as a delegate to the U.S.-Soviet Strategic Arms Reduction talks from 1983 to 86, and as Undersecretary of the Navy from 1977 to 79. He's also been a member of the National Commission on Terrorism and the Commission to Assess the Ballistic Missile Threat to the United States. We welcome you as well. Stansfield Turner was Director of Central Intelligence from 1977 to 1981. He is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1970 and to the rank of Admiral in 1975 when he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of NATO's Southern Flank. Admiral Turner has taught at Yale, at West Point, and at the University of Maryland Graduate School on Public Affairs. I want to thank each of you. You're very dedicated public servants who have given a great deal to your country. We look forward to hearing your testimony today as we fill in the details and, with your guidance, make the right decisions. Judge Webster, we'll start with you and your statement.
Thank you, Chairman Collins, Senator Lieberman, members of the committee, and also Chairman Roberts and Vice Chairman Rockefeller. Thank you for the privilege of appearing before you this morning to discuss some very important subjects. As I listen to the introductory remarks from your colleagues and from you, Madam Chairman, I was reminded of reading over the weekend from the extensive writings of Professor Darling, who recorded the first 5 or 6 years of Central Intelligence as an official document. And you will perhaps not be surprised to know that many of the issues that you raised this morning were raised at the time that President Truman had to make his ultimate decision on the balancing act between intelligence and the other departments of the government. But we do, of course, live in a different world today. Following an extensively documented and detailed narrative of the events leading up to September 11, 2001, the Commission concluded that coordination, amalgamation, and synthesis of intelligence collected by various components of the intelligence community were too loose, and in consequence, the dots were not connected in a way that the 9/11 plot could have been uncovered and prevented. The Commission addressed a new structure intended to reduce the likelihood of another catastrophic attack against the United States and its citizens. In my view, some of the omissions and errors in conclusions were attributable to human mistakes and misjudgments. Others were attributable in part to constraints, both legislative and administrative, that governed the interagency relationships in the period following the Church and Pike Committee reports to the 2001 Patriot Act revisions on sharing intelligence. Various proposals for managing need to share and preserving need to know had to address the almost Byzantine system of intelligence control that evolved during that three-decade period. I liken the current status of the Director of Central Intelligence to that of Den Chief in terms of his ability to control resources and compel effective teamwork throughout the 15 agencies spread through the departments of our government. It's remarkable what has been accomplished by consensus building, friendly cajoling, and a patriotic effort among so many agencies to make it work. But this is not enough to deal in a timely way with the complexities of the world in which we find ourselves. There is today a strong consensus that the authority of the intelligence community leader must be increased to do the job for which he must be responsible, to provide timely and useful intelligence upon which the President and policymakers can make sound decisions in the interest of our country. The intelligence community does not need a feckless czar with fine surroundings and little authority. That is the wrong way to go. Whether the Congress elects to create a true Director of National Intelligence, as the 9/11 Commission recommends, or to beef up the real, as distinguished from cosmetic, management authorities of the Director of Central Intelligence, as others have proposed, the designated leader must be clearly and unambiguously empowered to act and to decide on issues of great importance to the success of the intelligence community and to the country. There seems to be general agreement that additional authorities should repose at the top leader of the intelligence community. These authorities, although widely assumed by the American public to exist already, in fact are imprecise, easily frustrated, and not in regular use. They are: 1, management of the intelligence budget; 2, authority to name or at least approve the recommendations for presidential appointment of the top leaders of the intelligence community; and 3, performance review and evaluation of these community leaders. These authorities could be granted: 1, to the Director of Central Intelligence, who is also Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, or 2, to a Director of Central Intelligence who is separate from and senior to the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, or 3, a newly created National Intelligence Director who would replace the present Director of Central Intelligence. The concept of a National Intelligence Director has the present support of the President, the Democratic candidate for President, and the 9/11 Commission. The NID would have authority to oversee national intelligence centers on specific subjects of interest across the United States government and to manage the National Intelligence Program and oversee the agencies that contribute to it. It appears that the centers are expanded versions of centers which the DCI has created and operated in the past, but located elsewhere in other departments and agencies. Under the Commission model, the NID would manage the National Intelligence Program and oversee the component agencies of the intelligence community. The report envisages management through 3 deputies, each of whom would hold a key position in one of the component agencies. The Director of the CIA would head Foreign Intelligence. Defense Intelligence would be headed by the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and Homeland Intelligence would be headed by the FBI's Executive Assistant Director for Intelligence, or the Undersecretary of Homeland Security for Information Analysis and Infrastructure Protection. The 3 deputies would have the job of acquiring the systems, training the people, and executing the operations planned by the National Intelligence Center. Control of the budget is essential to effective management of the intelligence community. The President, in his remarks, has used the term coordinate, which I understand to mean management. Others have suggested something less. There is obviously some sorting out to be done between the Enhanced Intelligence Community Organization and its leader, and the Department of Defense and its secretary. If this model is adopted, the Defense Department will need some assurances that tactical military intelligence will not drift away from its military commanders. On the other hand, with respect to strategic intelligence around the world, defense agencies must be prepared to respond to the management initiatives of the National Intelligence Director. In all of this, I would sincerely hope that this will not be just another layer of government. The Director of Central Intelligence position would simply segue to the new National Intelligence Director at the top of the table of organization reporting to the President. The number of new positions needed to manage the outreach and responsibilities of the NID should be carefully controlled. A key proposal is to expand the current Terrorist Threat Integration Center as a center for joint operational planning and joint intelligence, and staffed by personnel from the various agencies. While there are a number of questions to be thought through and answered, such as the role of the center in operational activities, I believe the concept has merit for a number of reasons. First, I think it offers a potentially effective vehicle for dealing with the growing threat of international terrorism with full participation and sharing by agencies across the community. Second, and this is not a pejorative observation, there is a risk that the nation's preoccupation with terrorism may cause important and significant collections and analytical responsibilities of a non-terrorist nature to be neglected. Challenges, for example, such as the Cold War, major economic changes among have and have-not nations that cause wars, and other matters requiring our best collection and analytical efforts for the benefit of our policymakers must not be neglected nor subsumed. As we have all seen too painfully, sources that have been neglected after the fact can dry up and take years to redevelop when a new crisis emerges. This must not happen. The Director of Central Intelligence, as distinguished from CIA, has established a number of centers located for convenience at CIA headquarters. These have made substantial community-wide contributions. I believe they should stay with the intelligence leader, be denominated at his discretion, not legislated, and located where he and his principal advisors think most appropriate. With respect to covert and paramilitary actions, the Commission would keep responsibility for clandestine and covert operations in the CIA, but place lead responsibility for paramilitary action in the military. I have some doubts about this model. The Commission acknowledged that the combined activities in Afghanistan worked well. I would prefer to keep that model on a smaller turn-of-the-dime activities with the CIA. Larger scale actions that are essentially troop engagements should be in defense. With respect to relations with the President, while the leader of the intelligence community must be the principal advisor on intelligence to the President, he must work hard, very hard, to avoid either the reality or the perception that intelligence is being framed, spun, to support a foreign policy of the administration. My predecessor, Bill Casey, had a different view of this. He served in the cabinet and participated fully in the formulation of policy. When I became DCI, I asked President Reagan not to put me in the cabinet for the reasons I have noted to you. He told me that he thought about it and had come to the conclusion that I was right. I was very pleased, therefore, to see that President Bush had reached a similar conclusion. The head of intelligence community does not need to be located in the White House, and to avoid these problems, I believe he should not be. The Director of Central Intelligence has had a small suite in the old Executive Office building through the years as a matter of convenience for meetings with White House officials and between appointments. I believe that is more than adequate, and that he should be housed where he has access to people with whom he most frequently needs to consult. With respect to the FBI and Homeland Security, the FBI should be, as it has in the past, a part of the efforts to coordinate national intelligence collection efforts with international activities. This is more in the nature of putting the information together, completing the dots, and other efforts to avoid information gaps. I think it is important that operationally the FBI should take its guidance from the Attorney General on its dealings with U.S. persons and the manner in which it collects information in the United States. This has been an important safeguard for the American people, should not be destructive of effective operations, and avoids the risk of receiving vigilante-type instructions, whether from the intelligence community or the White House. While, as Justice Jackson once wrote, the Constitution is not a suicide pact, the Constitution, and the rule of law are at the top of our core values and must be safeguarded and respected. With respect to the Trusted Information Network, the Commission recommends an overhaul of our information system to better process, share, and protect intelligence across the agencies. This has considerable merit and will require more work in some agencies than others. As long ago as 2001, I headed a commission on FBI internal security, and we provided 4 classified appendices to our report dealing with the infirmities of the FBI mainframe, now 13 years old. Inability to rapidly identify and capture information of value to other agencies aggravated the circumstances leading to the 9/11 tragedy. The 9/11 Commission has issued a special challenge to the Congress to overhaul its oversight systems for dealing with the intelligence community. If acted upon, it will materially increase the effectiveness not only of oversight, but of the performance of the community in its relationship to the Congress. I am told that over 88 separate committees and subcommittees now oversight the Homeland Security Department. This is really intolerable, not to say nonsensical. Consideration should be given to a joint committee on intelligence, selected with care and including a nonpartisan, highly respected membership. At this moment in our history, I believe we have passed the moment of great fear, which often produces unhappy solutions, and we have not yet entered a period of indifference where it is difficult to take the forward steps that are needed. We need to act, but we must act with great care. The many thousands of dedicated men and women in the intelligence community, many of whom have put their lives on the line for the safety of our country, count on you. I know you will not let them down. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Judge, for an excellent statement. Mr. Woolsey.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, Senator Lieberman, members of the committee, Senator Roberts, Senator Rockefeller, it's an honor to be able to testify before you today. Let me say at the outset that I believe if I could have my whole statement submitted for the record, Madam Chairman, I'll use it as an outline to speak from far more briefly. At the outset, let me say that I believe the Commission's report is quite well written. It is an excellent history of much of what went wrong over the years. We will doubtless understand amendments to it, but it is a fine job, and particularly for an official government document written by a large number of people, it is in excellent prose. its first 300-plus pages, I think, are an outstanding example of work of a commission of this sort, and I'm a veteran of 5 of these national commissions. Of the 41 proposals for reform, recommendations that it makes in its final 2 chapters, I agree fully with 35 of them. 5, I think, should be adopted in a partial or amended form. 1, the proposal to transfer all covert paramilitary work to the Department of Defense, I could not disagree more with. Let me say a word about the scope of the Commission's report as a whole. It titles Chapter 12, where it makes the bulk of its recommendations, a global strategy. This may be a case of having a misleading headline on an otherwise perfectly reasonable press story, but I want to stress that this chapter, and indeed the Commission report as a whole, does not present a global strategy for the war in which we are engaged. This Commission's tasking, as I read it from the congressional legislation and from its own forward, is far more like those commissions that assessed Pearl Harbor during World War II. They did not seek to establish a grand strategy for the fighting of World War II, and this commission neither should seek, and it certainly does not succeed in establishing a global strategy for the war that we are in. For example, the recommendations do not deal at all with Iran, Iraq, Syria, or our oil dependence on the Middle East. And I think it's important to realize that its focus is pretty much exclusively on how to keep an organization like Al-Qaeda from attacking the United States again the way it did before. This is an understandable focus. That's what it was charged to do with. But the next part of a war is not always like the previous part of a war. And we should not assume that this report states a global strategy. Just a word about its recommendations in Chapter 12. There are 4 sensible recommendations about how to deal with terror sanctuaries in other countries. 5 about essentially alleviating root causes of terrorism. 7 that are essentially technical, dealing with things like biometric entry-exit screening. And 4 dealing with first responders' needs. A number of these all of these I think are quite sound, but none of those 21 really reaches the level of dealing with strategic matters. Then there are 3 recommendations that essentially say we should show balance. Share information while safeguarding privacy, enhance executive branch power only when necessary. These are perfectly reasonable recommendations, but they're also quite vague, and they don't give us much help in deciding issues that are important and right now before the country, such as should the federal government require birth dates from air passengers in order better to utilize databases to identify individuals who might be terrorists? Or should police continue to be barred by local ordinances, as they are in many municipalities, from inquiring of immigration authorities about the immigration status of someone they've arrested for a state or local offense? I want to call to particularly Senator Roberts and Senator Rockefeller's attention that the next 2.5 pages of my testimony on pages 3, 4, and 5 I wrote before I knew they were going to be here today, because they essentially constitute a praise, as I offered before the Senate Select Committee, of the analysis which the Senate Select Committee did of the relationship between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. I think that it is far more nuanced and far sounder than what we have from the Commission. And I also believe it is important for us to understand that we face not just one totalitarian enemy in the Middle East. We face at least 3. The secular Baathists, who are essentially fascists, modeled after the fascists of the 20s and 30s. The Islamists from the Shiite side of Islam, run and operated, whether they are Hezbollah or Muqtada al-Sadr out of Tehran. And the Islamists from the Sunni side of Islam, such as Al-Qaeda, its underlying economic sustenance fueled by the oil money of the Gulf, and its ideology fueled by the hatred put forth by the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia. I think it's important that we should understand that these three totalitarian groups hate each other, stem from different roots, criticize each other, kill each other from time to time, but still are capable here and there of cooperation against us, just as Hitler and Stalin surprised the world in 1939, including most of the world's intelligence analysts, by forging the Hitler-Stalin Pact. So I believe it's important to pay attention to what the Senate Select Committee says in Chapter 12 about the rather extensive connections, not operational, but connections, particularly with respect to training between al-Qaeda and the Baathists of Iraq. Moving on to page 5, Madam Chairman, and the recommendations of Chapter 13. I concur with the Commission's most publicized recommendation, essentially to split the current job of the Director of Central Intelligence and set up a separate individual to manage the intelligence community and serve as the President's chief advisor on intelligence from the individual who would be the head of the CIA and responsible for management of it. I also concur with the establishment of a National Counterterrorism Center reporting to the new NID. Just a quick word about Senator Rockefeller's interesting analogy to a custody arrangement for the current relationship between the DCI and much of the community. It is, in a sense, a custody settlement, but the Director of Central Intelligence under the current system is the party who gets only very rare and brief visitation rights. It is a very weak position currently from the point of view of managing either the personnel or the money within the intelligence community. And I do believe that it is a job, the current DCI job, is a job that should be divided. It's not impossible for one person to do this job under the current circumstances if that person has a close working relationship with the President, the general support of the Congress, and close working relationships with 8 members of the Congress, the 4 chairmen of the 2 intelligence committees and their ranking members, and the chairman of the Defense Appropriations subcommittees and their ranking members. But in my case, I didn't have a bad relationship with the President I served. I just didn't have much of one at all. And with respect to the committee chairman and ranking members, I had 7 good relationships and 1 bad one, as my testimony summarizes. What that meant was, because of those 2 circumstances, it was in 1993, Congress was in session 195 days, and I had 205 appointments on Capitol Hill, more than once a day for the time Congress was in session. Much of that was because of what has been publicized a number of times, my disagreements with the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee at the time, Senator DeConcini, over a range of issues, terminating satellite programs, terminating computers for NSA, terminating funds for Arabic and Farsi language instruction, closing large numbers of CIA stations around the world, transferring all overseas penetration of foreign intelligence services to the FBI, and so forth. Some of these disputes I won, some I lost, but it did take a very substantial amount of time. Should some future DCI under the current structure have to spend that type of time and resources dealing with congressional oversight, I think it's easy to see how it would be very difficult for him or her to have enough hours in the day also to manage the CIA. I do think it is important to focus on the precise responsibilities of the new NID, and I favor over the original White House formulation and over the Commission's formulation, the formulation in Representative Jane Harman's original bill. In her original bill, she made the appointments and personnel process for defense intelligence agencies, such as NSA, a joint matter between the NID and the Secretary of Defense, and joint responsibility, of course, with respect to counterterrorism work at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, joint with the Department of Justice. Her bill also gave responsibility for budget execution, essentially, to the NID, but left the Secretary of Defense and the Attorney General in appropriate cases much more of an opportunity to contest some such decisions before the President than I see in the Commission's bill. I believe the Commission's bill leans, frankly, a bit too heavily toward czardom. And if there is one term I would like to see if we could get out of this debate, it is, in fact, intelligence czar. As far as I'm concerned, a number of centuries of stupidity, rigidity, and authoritarianism, followed by the victory of Bolshevism, is not a good model for the management of American intelligence. With respect to information sharing, sharing is fine as long as one is not sharing with the Walkers, Aldrich Ames, Robert Hansen, or some blabbermouth who likes to talk to the press about the fact that we have broken bin Laden's satellite telephone communications. The problem is that we don't just need to share, we need to share wisely. And the more one knows about intelligence sources and methods for a particular piece of intelligence, frequently the better one is able to interpret it, and the better job of analysis one is able to do. That's why the President's Daily Brief has a lot of material in it about sources and methods, and why sources and methods are guarded as carefully as they are. I think the NID needs to have different approaches toward different parts of the intelligence process with respect to the degree of uniformity he requires, with respect, he or she, with respect to the degree of sharing, with respect to the degree of permitting in competition and even freelancing. For example, at the front end of the process, development of new collection methods can benefit from competition between agencies. We were competitive at the CIA with the Defense Department in '93. That's how we developed the Predator. In tasking collection, customers should be consulted, not just the operators of the collection systems. That is important because it is one reason why we need to move away from the stovepiping that we now see. In processing data, also, we need to move away from stovepipes. In analyzing data and producing intelligence, some competition is not a bad thing at all. It's a good idea to have a competitive analysis. And in dissemination, I would prefer a system whereby need to know is constantly reviewed and enforced technically, rather than one in which, as the Commission suggests, need to know should always take a second place to need to share. Let me close, Madam Chairman, with just one word about paramilitary action being transferred to the Pentagon, which I believe is an extraordinarily bad idea. Covert paramilitary operations are only occasionally necessary for the United States. Covert should connote keeping them secret or denying them, plausibly or otherwise, not only before but after the fact. It was because covert action generally, including covert paramilitary operations, came into question in the mid-1970s that Congress, for good and sufficient reason, decided to place such covert action under the requirement for having presidentially signed findings and submission to the intelligence committees of the Congress. I think that was a wise decision, and for covert action, that process should be continued, including paramilitary covert action, which we deny plausibly or otherwise after the fact. Sometimes that is necessary. Sometimes one needs to save the face of an enemy as well as that of friends and allies. But the Pentagon doesn't do that now. The Pentagon does conduct clandestine military operations, which are kept secret ahead of time, or which involve deception ahead of time, and that is as old as warfare, considerably older than the Trojan horse. I think it's important that we not move to a situation whereby the Pentagon, because it has responsibility for covert paramilitary operations, also gets brought under the machinery of findings and the rest, which the CIA covert action now operates under. I think that could cripple our special forces in the war against terrorism, and I think it's a very bad idea. In conclusion, let me just say that, as stated above, I think it's quite likely, because of the limited nature of the charge they were given, that is the reason the Commission did not come up with anything approximating a global strategy, but we should not assume that they did so. Second, since so much attention is being paid to foreign intelligence in the Commission's report, it may be natural for some to draw the conclusion that, with respect to 9/11, foreign intelligence is what principally failed. Now, many aspects of our government, of our country, failed with respect to 9/11, but we should at least note that most of the preparations for 9/11 took place in two countries, Germany and the U.S., where the foreign intelligence operation of the United States doesn't really collect intelligence. That satellites are going to tell us very little about terrorists. Signal intercepts are going to tell us very little, particularly if we talk about what signal intercepts we are obtaining. And so foreign intelligence reforms generally may have only a modest effect in the war on terrorism. It may be much more important whether there's a municipal ordinance that bars checking out a tip from a citizen about, say, what a Saudi visitor's immigration status is. And finally, even within the field of foreign intelligence reform, some substantive reforms, such as whether we use non-official cover officers far more than we do now and rely less on official cover, to my mind probably would make more difference than issues such as the establishment of an NID. But within the framework of the Commission's recommendations and within the framework of this committee's deliberations, I would support the establishment of an appropriately designed office of NID, and I thank you again, Madam Chairman and members of the committee, for your attention.
Thank you very much. Admiral Turner.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, Chairman Roberts, Vice Chairman Rockefeller, I much appreciate this opportunity to be with you and the honor of being here. I come at this issue of whether we want a national intelligence director from the point of view of someone who was a guinea pig national intelligence director from 1977 to 1981. President Carter's concept of how our intelligence apparatus should operate was very similar to the recommendation of the 9/11 Commission that we're talking about today. At my very first meeting with the President, before he had actually designated me as his nominee for Director of Central Intelligence, he gave me oral instruction that if I took this job, I was to concentrate on being the Director of Central Intelligence, not on being the head of the CIA. As a result, I delegated 80% of the responsibility for the CIA to the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. For instance, I would come before committees of the Congress and testify on the overall intelligence budget. Frank Carlucci, the deputy, would then follow with a detailed explanation of the CIA's portion of that budget. This freed me up to concentrate on managing the intelligence community. In particular, it freed me up to participate very actively in the analytic portion of the intelligence process, which of course leads to estimates, which are one of the key products of intelligence. And therefore, the analytic process deserves the personal attention of the Director of Central Intelligence. Moreover, unless the Director personally participates in the analytic process, it's not going to be as good as it should be. Only the Director can adjudicate big differences between the various analytic agencies. So his or her participation is the only way to avoid having consensus intelligence by committee. If he or she does not give that leadership, it won't be there. President Carter's oral directive to me to concentrate on the community not only freed me up to help manage the community, but he also gave me specific authorities in a presidential executive order. The first, one we've discussed a lot today, was over budgets. We still had a committee to review the budgets of the entire intelligence community, but in accordance with President Carter's executive order, there was only one vote on the committee, mine. This way we could develop a budget that had a theme to it. We could ensure that the budget covered all the bases we wanted to cover with the priorities we wanted to cover. We established a deputy for budgets. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense did dispute my choices for the budgets of various of their agencies and took their disputes to the President in an annual meeting we had to review the budgets, and sometimes they won, sometimes they lost. But nonetheless, there still was a theme to the budget with small perturbations to it. Secondly, the President's executive order gave me the authority to direct the priorities for the agencies collecting intelligence. We had a deputy here also, and when we needed intelligence on some certain problem, the deputy would get together representatives of the various agencies that collect, NSA, NRO, the DO of the CIA, and he would say, or she would say, who can help in this aspect of this problem that we've got? And then the deputy for collection would assign priorities to these various agencies, would assign roughly what kind of assets, what kind of resources are we going to give to this problem. This also was very useful because as they sat around the table looking at individual problems, there was an exchange of intelligence about what they were finding, and the clue that a photograph might tell you led to focusing an intercept capability, which led to putting a human agent in the scene. A third authority the President's executive order gave was to task the analytic agencies. This wasn't a question of what their answers were going to be, it was a question of what topics did they analyze. We tried always to have a procedure where there were 2 or maybe 3 analytic agencies working on the same problem independently and separately until they came up with their opinions, and then we would attempt to fuse them. But we encouraged bringing the diverse views forward. The 9/11 recommendations are really, in my view, a reincarnation of President Carter's program and are not nearly as big a change as people are talking about. And I'm not worried about a huge bureaucracy. We've got a bureaucracy out there that the DCI has today to manage the intelligence community. We're just going to change the name on the door. The worst result that could happen from this, though, in my opinion, is that we create a national intelligence director and not give him or her authority. Such a national intelligence director without authorities and without specific control of the CIA, and I very much encourage the separation of the national intelligence director from the CIA, but without the CIA and without new authorities, this is a job that's going to be impotent. I would also like to suggest quickly that there are a couple of other authorities that it would be useful for you to ensure are given to the new National Intelligence Director. We've talked, and the report does cover hiring and firing, but I would suggest that that shouldn't go as far as the 9/11 Commission report suggests. The heads of the analytic agencies, the DIA in the Defense Department, the INR in the State Department, the DO in the CIA, they should not be subject to the National Intelligence Director's appointment, hiring, and firing. The secretaries of those departments deserve to have their own intelligence advisor whom they have personal confidence in. And if you insist that they take somebody they don't like, they will just create a new intelligence operation of their own on the side anyway. So I think those are departmental responsibilities. Secondly, I think it's very important that we define what is national intelligence, what is in the national intelligence budget. It's ridiculous today that some 80% of the intelligence budget, if I understand it, is in programs like the Tactical Tiara program or the Joint Military Intelligence Program. One of the ways the Defense Department countered President Carter's having designated me as the director of the budgets was to begin to take things out of my budget, put them in these tactical budgets. I suggest that you draw a line here. The line is that it's only tactical if it's tasked only by a commander in the field. Thirdly, we need to be sure that whatever legislation there is here authorizes the director or the National Intelligence Director to direct the dissemination of intelligence. Today, individual agency heads, in the name of protecting sources and methods, have all kinds of devices for controlling who gets the intelligence they have. And it's perfectly reasonable to try to protect sources and methods, but there has to be a national balance between the importance to the country of exchanging that information, at least on some limited basis, and protecting the sources. And the person to make that judgment in the national interest is not the head of the agency, who's very concerned with the sources and methods. It's the National Intelligence Director we're going to create. Finally, the key point here is that whether we should increase the authority of the National Intelligence Director at the expense of the Department of Defense is one that only you in the Congress can address at this time. If we're going to act soon, it seems very clear that adjudicating within the executive branch and getting the Department of Defense to give up territory, getting the CIA to accept being separated from direct access to the President is just going to be bureaucratically too difficult. And I would finally suggest to you, please, if we're serious about the war on terrorism, we've got to appreciate that while it was all right in many ways for the Defense Department to control our intelligence operations to the high degree that it has since 1947, during a Cold War, when the threat to this country was a military threat. That's changed. And if it's changed, we deserve to change who controls our intelligence so that it is done not in the military interest, but in the national interest. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Admiral. Judge Webster, the 9/11 Commission documents very well the failure to share information between the FBI and the CIA. And the Commission documents the legal and cultural barriers that prevented that information sharing. And that's one reason that the Commission has proposed that the National Intelligence Director have authority over both the domestic and foreign side of intelligence. In his written statement submitted to the committee, former DCI Robert Gates raises some serious concerns about vesting in the new intelligence director the authority over both domestic and foreign intelligence. And he talks, as you did briefly in your statement, about President Truman's fear that if those two areas were under one person, you might create an American KGB, I believe Truman said. Dr. Gates has suggested that we need to put some safeguards, and that one such safeguard might be to restrict the NID to receiving domestic intelligence only with respect to certain categories of threats, like terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, international drug trafficking. Since you have served as both head of the FBI and the CIA, I would very much like to get your assessment of what safeguards, if any, we need to include if we are going to give the new director authority over the foreign and domestic divide.
Madam Chairman, Dr. Gates' suggestion of categories is an interesting one and deserves further consideration by the committee. My earlier remarks had to do with operations, primarily with operations, getting the intelligence and how to get the intelligence, and making sure that when dealing with U.S. citizens, we did it in a manner that comported with our requirements, our values, and sometimes I liken that to the investigation of the assassination of President Lincoln, when we arrested 2,000 people. All the cast of My American Cousin did a whole range of things which were commensurate with the forensic skills and capability at the time. We now have other means of getting information. Some of it required warrants, some of it does not. I prefer that the Attorney General be involved in the process of determining how information is obtained and whether or not it requires a warrant or requires whatever restrictions. The Patriot Act liberated a lot of the frustrations with respect to focusing on telephones rather than on individuals and matters of that kind. It's been roundly criticized, but most of those changes, I think, were constructive ones. There has to be a relationship between international intelligence and domestic intelligence, which recognizes the need at the domestic level to provide information to those who are concerned with the overall international aspects. A major problem, and this goes beyond your question a little, but I think it's so fundamental, and that is to pay attention to the information gathering techniques that we have today and how they were constructed. A 13-year-old mainframe simply does not work today to do what you would like to see done. They're trying to improve it. The patch jobs, Congress has voted some money for Trilogy and others, still very limiting. The ability to make sure that information collected in a particular way by the FBI can be transmitted on responsible demand from the NID or whoever has the authority to request that information can in fact be done, and done in a timely way. It's badly lacking now, and I think a lot of those dots could have been connected had they had the ability to respond. They now have the charter to respond. Bottom line, we can do a lot more. We need better equipment, we need the will, the message is out there, and I think that the focus of the Congress should at least be on how the information is collected.
Thank you. Mr. Woolsey, a major issue facing this committee in drafting the bill is how much authority the director, the National Intelligence Director, or the director of the Counterterrorism Center should have in tasking the collection of information by the various intelligence agencies. I raised a scenario in a previous hearing of what if you had a satellite that was over Iraq and DOD wanted it to stay over Iraq, the CIA wanted it to be shifted to Afghanistan. In your experience, how are those conflicts resolved, and should the director have tasking authority?
I think that the director should have more tasking authority than is now implemented, Madam Chairman. The history of this is that going back, there was more collective tasking than there is now. There used to be a committee called Comarex that tasked the satellites, for example, in which the whole community participated. When I was the head of a panel for Bob Gates in the summer of 1992 looking at restructuring the National Reconnaissance Office and its programs, we came up with something we called the needs process, which was relatively straightforward. We had a very experienced intelligence officer, analyst, make the rounds of the customers, not just the people who operated collection systems, but the customers, including Treasury, State, so forth, and come back with us with a judgment about what their needs were and whether they were being balanced properly by the official process. I tried to keep something like that going when I was Director of Central Intelligence, but things like that often get bureaucratized rather quickly. The problem is that today the SIGINT people tend to task SIGINT, and the satellite people tend to task satellites. And I think one important positive reform that could come from having an NID or a CTC director under him or her is that you could have a process whereby intelligence consumers could have more influence, again, filtered through the balanced judgment of some professionals, but nonetheless more influence than they have now. So I would regard that as one positive outcome of having an NID or a CTC. And I must say, with respect to the question that Judge Webster answered, I think another reason to have an NID is that with the restrictions he mentioned, which are very important, it's a better idea to have someone other than the head of the CIA be the person to whom someone with responsibility in the Justice Department or the FBI reports. I go into this some in my statement, so I won't go into it any further here, but I'd much prefer an NID to have some type of limited joint authority over CIA or foreign intelligence and domestic intelligence rather than the individual who is the head of the CIA.
Thank you. One very quick final question that I'd like all three of you to answer, and we'll start with Admiral Turner. Should the NID serve at the pleasure of the President or have a term? Admiral?
Absolutely absolutely at the pleasure of the President.
Mr. Woolsey?
I agree.
Judge Webster?
I agree, and I don't think you can do anything about it. People cite the FBI 10-year term as a model. If you read the statute, it says not more than 10 years. It was a reaction to 48 years of one director. The Constitution protects the executive authority to hire and to fire, and I don't believe that if you had a quasi-legislative thing like the Federal Reserve Board or something like that, yes, but I think constitutionally it would be very difficult to do. They tried to do it with the FBI and concluded they could not do that.
Thank you. Senator Lieberman?
Thanks, Madam Chairman. So I liked your answer, Judge Webster, that progress sometimes is limiting a term that went 41 years to only 10 years, and we move forward. Somebody said to me about those terms, and it's a relevant point as we think about this office, that fortunately we had recent experience with this, that you can have somebody in a term that goes beyond the term of the President, but what happens if the President loses confidence in that individual and simply does not talk to him? That's as bad or worse than the fear of them getting too close. I thank you all for your testimony. I found it very helpful. Senator Rockefeller said something in his opening statement I want to quote, which is that we're operating in a system now in the intelligence community that is fundamentally 57 years old, and it was created during a very different time in world history when we were facing the rising threat of the Soviet Union. Of course, it's been changed here and there, but fundamentally it remains the same. Admiral Turner, you said that at the end of your statement in terms of the balance of authority between the intelligence director and, for instance, the Secretary of Defense. And I think we really have to keep that in mind. To me, it all comes down to the fact that in a war on terrorism, intelligence, which of course has always played a critical role in warfare, plays an even more critical role because we're dealing with, not with armies massed on a field or navies at sea. They may strike, they may surprise, but then you have the opportunity to come back. These are people who are prepared to kill themselves to kill us, and they will strike in an isolated way as they have continued to do. So intelligence becomes even more critical as a way to stop the attack before it happens, and that's why we're focusing all this attention on our intelligence system and community. I do want to ask you about the relative balance between Department of Defense and the proposed National Intelligence Director, because obviously, as others have said, this is going to be a critical and most difficult part of our work here. The Defense Department, as indicated by some testimony offered last week on the House side, does appear to be concerned about the recommendation that the new Intelligence Director be given control over intelligence budgets, arguing that might reduce ultimately the intelligence available to combat commanders. They've expressed the fear of exactly what of Senator Collins' example or hypothetical, that NID would favor using national assets like satellites to provide more strategic intelligence to policymakers on terrorism rather than more operational or tactical intelligence to military commanders. But I think the 9/11 Commission is saying that's exactly why we need one person with the budget authority to make those judgments, because it may well be more in the national interest to make those assignments to the war on terrorism as opposed to the Department of Defense. And some of the Defense Department have said that they were going to carry on this fight because they had to do it on behalf of the warfighters, although Commissioner Hamilton said he thought it was unimaginable that military intelligence would not continue to be a very high, if not the highest priority for our intelligence community. I wonder if each of you would give me a response to whether you think the balance of authority here, assuming for a moment that we adopt something like the Commission proposal of an NID with budget authority, whether the balance of authority now has to not shift away from the Pentagon, but to shift to somebody on top who, as you fascinatingly were during the Carter administration, has the authority to make judgments between intelligence, war on terrorism, Pentagon. Admiral Turner, why don't you start?
Senator Lieberman, one other aspect of the Carter executive order was that we would periodically rehearse the transfer of tasking authority over the collection elements from the Director of Central Intelligence to the Secretary of Defense, for the possibility that we would one day be in a really active war where intelligence was absolutely vital to the Defense Department, and therefore you maybe would not want the Director of Central Intelligence, a non-military person normally, to make those judgments. And so we would, from time to time, for a week or something like this, say, my deputy for collection tasking was now taking his instructions from Harold Brown over in the Defense Department rather than from me, which gave the Defense Department a fallback position. They would just have to go to the President and say, sir, we think the time has come under this crisis that we're in right now that we ought to take this away from Admiral Turner out there and do it ourselves. And that was, I think, a good compromise.
There's some language in the 9/11 Commission report that suggests that they see the same kind of dispute resolution mechanism here, either through the National Security Advisor or, obviously, ultimately the President. Mr. Woolsey?
Senator Lieberman, I believe one of the older statutes already essentially permits transfer of tasking authority in wartime to the Defense Department. To my mind, tasking is readily dealt with through executive order. You don't need legislation about tasking, I don't think. I think that the NID ought to have more authority than the DCI has now, and it ought to be more collectively done with an eye toward consumers, including the Defense Department. And I think that's one thing that we've learned from the Commission report and from the war on terrorism. Particularly important, though, is fusing foreign and domestic tasking and intelligence. That's really what's new. And I don't think the Commission report or anything else that I've seen demonstrates that the Defense Department is the principal problem with what went wrong with respect to 9/11. We have had also some important successes over the course of the last 2 decades in utilizing not just tactical systems, but national systems directly and immediately on the battlefield. And that's had a lot to do with the Secretary of Defense's hand in managing many aspects of the defense agencies in intelligence. I think, to go back to Senator Rockefeller's analogy about the child custody, which I'm intrigued by, I think the most important thing is not to have a divorce between the Secretary of Defense and the NID. When I was DCI, I had excellent relations with first Les Aspin and then with Bill Perry as Secretaries of Defense, and we worked together on things quite collaboratively. We had a single baseball cap with chairman on it, and we'd co-chair meetings, and sometimes I'd put it on and sometimes he'd put it on. We just worked it out. So I think the Harmon formulation, frankly, is superior to both that of the Commission and that of the original version I heard from the White House, because I think it strikes a balance requiring joint appointments of individuals such as the Director of NSA, and it gives the Secretary of Defense a word in budget execution, although it leaves the principal authority to move money around in the hands of the NID. I think that's a better solution than what I've heard from either the Commission or initially from the White House.
Thank you. Judge Webster?
I think I'm largely in agreement with that. With 80% of the budget in defense, so the elephant is in the room. And how you create a relationship between the NID and the Secretary of Defense becomes very important. There have always been a principle of reclama on serious issues of disagreement, and they've worked well. In my 4.5 years at CIA, the Secretary of Defense only exercised that one time, and that provided 2 of us in chairs in the Oval Office with the President, and he made the decision. I don't know whether we're too much anxious that it's going to create a serious problem. I agree that this problem did not affect the missing of the dots. I see nothing in there to think that was the problem. During the Gulf War, we pulled satellites that were dedicated to watching the Soviet Union closely and moved them into the Middle East and worked closely with them. That worked very well. We had one unexpected issue, which was again resolved by the deliberative process with the National Security Advisor acting at the instruction of the President, where our analysts disagreed with what we saw about whether the number of tanks that had been destroyed and Scud launchers that had been destroyed, which was the key to the President's authorization to begin the land war. Those things don't happen very often, but I think in retrospect, looking back on it, while I think that CIA was right, it would have been better not to have had that, would have been better for the military to have had that choice and made that final judgment.
Thank you. My time's up. Can I ask for a one-word answer from all of you? I'm following the Chairman's precedent. I'm curious whether you briefed the President yourself personally, and if not, generally speaking, how often you spoke to him. You know, we just come through a period where the Director, now the Acting Director of CIA, has given the President a daily intelligence briefing. Did you do that, Judge Webster?
Yes, I did, Senator, most days.
Yes.
I had a briefer there every morning, so I didn't feel an obligation to it. But this was the first time in a long time that the President, then President Bush, took his briefing directly from
Right.
CIA, previously been through the National Security Advisor.
Mr. Woolsey?
A handful of times early in the administration, President Clinton had me and the briefer in. Normally, thereafter, he almost always read the daily briefing. Other than that, I had 2 substantive meetings with him in 2 years, 1 a year.
Yeah.
President Carter preferred to read the President's daily brief. I had a half-hour session with him 3 times a week for the first several years to bring him up on other intelligence aspects.
Very interesting. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Senator Roberts.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to cut to the chase again like everybody else has. We hear the idea of having a NID is good only if it comes with some greater power than currently resides in the office of the DCI. If we do not, it is argued we run the risk of really creating an intelligence czar and causing more harm to the community than good. In other words, you have two hats, and you shift the deck chairs on the good ship intelligence, then we're back again in 6 months having, I guess, more hearings. But at any rate, I think I hear from you all three saying that you agree that if a NID is created, we must empower it, that you agree that greater control over DOD NFIP budgets, that's the National Foreign Intelligence Program, should be included in these broader powers. Well, here's the question. Here's the question that faces, or the challenge, or the frustration that faces Senator Rockefeller, Senator Durbin, and Senator Levin and myself. As you have said before, I think Admiral Turner said it, that the Defense Department controls 80% of the funding. And the Intelligence Committee then controls 20%. That adds up to 10% of the total DOD funding in regards to the money that they control. And then we try to make some sense out of the difference, pardon these acronyms, but the intelligence community absolutely devours them, and then they change them every once in a while. One is Tierra, and when you're talking about Tierra, other than the one that we're going to give to the distinguished chairwoman, that's tactical. And everybody pretty well figures out with the four services that the Department of Defense and that commander in the field would have that capability. One is called JMIP. Now that's the satellites. That's the collection. That's tremendously important, where we have to maintain our technology. And then there's the NFIP, which is what I've explained, the National Foreign Intelligence Program. That's the strategic and the counterterrorism. And the whole idea is, how do you meld these together under a NID so that it works? Now, right now, under the Defense Department, you have the Defense Intelligence Agency, you have NSA, you have the NRO, you have NEMA. I'm sorry, they've changed that acronym. It's NGIA. And then you have the four services. 9 of the 15 intelligence agencies, 9 of the 15 are controlled literally by the Defense Department. Now, this leads to something that I've called torn between two masters. Let me give you 2 examples. When we had an urgent need, at the request of many senators, more especially Senator Levin, who was an absolute tiger on this, when the Iraq Survey Group went to Iraq to look for the weapons of mass destruction, there was an effort all community-wide to say, okay, who has experience in regards to Iraq? And in the State Department, they have a small arm of intelligence, and the request came to the State Department. I won't get into the number that was requested. Secretary Powell said, no, I'm sorry, you can't go. I'm shorthanded. I need you here. David Kay from Orders on High said, no, we need you with the Iraq Survey Group. Does that analyst that has 20 years of experience and possibly a PhD, who does he work for? Or who does she work for? Does she work for Secretary Powell, or does she work for the new NID? Or does she work for the Secretary of Defense? Let me give you another example. There's the Defense Intelligence Agency, obviously under the Secretary of Defense. The NID says, you know, we got a real problem in surge capacity in Colombia. We need 300 DIA agents now. Move them, please. And the Secretary of Defense says, no, I'm sorry, we still need them in regards to Afghanistan. We're about to have an election there. If we possibly can, we're not going to do it. Now, if you're torn between two masters, it seems to me that that is the big problem. Now, I'm assuming that all three of you indicate that the NID must be empowered, must have greater control over the DOD budgets. Where we get into problems is, do you move all 9 of these agencies? You wouldn't move 9, you wouldn't move the services, I'm sure. That's tactical. But there are 5 others here. Would you move them over to the NID's authority, or would you not? Or would you try to work out something in which case the Undersecretary for Intelligence for Defense, Mr. Steve Cambone, now would meet with, say, a 4-star, if that's the way to do it, or some kind of intermediary functionary to try to work this out on a better basis. That seems to me to be the big problem or challenge as we have is trying to forge a bill. Would any of you have any comments?
Mr. Chairman, I think that this is one where the Washington version of the golden rule, that whoever has the gold makes the rules, will apply. If budget execution authority is given to the NID, he will or she will have a much better ability to say to the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, look, I sympathize, I understand, I know this fluent Arabic language linguist is a very rare asset, but you didn't hear me, I really need her or him. I don't think one needs to, in legislation or perhaps even executive order, get into the business of precisely who assigns. What the intelligence community works in a collaborative way a lot of the time. But the hardest cases are precisely the ones you mentioned because experienced and talented people are much harder to find than dollars or just bodies to fill slots. And so I'm not surprised that Secretary Powell or the Secretary of Defense in other circumstances would struggle against having one of their very best people detailed. I think this will follow reasonably from a solution generally in favor of what the NID needs will follow from the NID having the kind of enhanced budget authority that is being talked about, even if it's not total budget authority that of the sort that's in the commission bill. Or commission recommendations.
Admiral Turner, do you have anything to say? Or
I would just come back to my comment that we have to make up our minds, is terrorism number one or is it not? And if it is, then the NID should have the ability to say, I'm sorry, Secretary Powell, I really need that group of people or whatever it is in this other capacity.
My former deputy, Richard Kerr, made an interesting observation the other day. It's worth repeating that intelligence is really a service industry, a service to many other departments, fields, and needs. And I think that the NID, as the head of that, has a duty to listen. And he has to listen understandably. And then he has a duty to decide. And if the Congress wants to put a reclama provision in there or to suggest that the department head is not satisfied, he can take it up higher, that'd be fine. It tends not to work that way very often. Nobody wants to do that until they really think they need it. So I think that kind of a system can still work.
my time has expired, Madam Chairman, and I thank you for the time, but I think that is one of the very crucial decisions we have to make. I think one of the witnesses said something about breaking the China. I can assure you there's another committee in the Congress upon which I am privileged to serve who has quite a bit of feeling about this. They're having hearings this afternoon and tomorrow, which I will attend. And I think the decision, Madam Chairman, is do we really transfer all of those agencies over to the NID, or is there some kind of transformational authority whereby, I don't want to say force, but they are that they certainly work together in better fashion than they do now? And that's an absolute and very important question, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Senator Rockefeller.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to ask a kind of a generic or philosophical question. Throughout all of the hearings that have taken place so far, there has been this undercurrent of nervousness about the so-called 80-20 relationship. And that can't help but feed into the strength of the personality of the Secretary of Defense, the strength of the personality of the Vice President who was Secretary of Defense, and perhaps a tendency of Condoleezza Rice to lean a bit in that direction. Now, it could be that we're making ourselves walk around too many corners or twisting ourselves up on all of this, unless there is some absolute reason that a Secretary of Defense has to have budget authority. In other words, if the NID has budget authority, that becomes a direct threat to the Secretary of Defense. And thus the committees begin to fight and the bureaucracies begin to fight and the press begins to take sides. And it's not healthy because, as Admiral Turner said, what counts is the national interest. Now, my question is this. You have 15 different intelligence agencies. We've just created another one in Homeland Security. And you could, I suppose, let's say, take out NSA, NRO, the geospatial. You could take some of those out and say, well, let the Secretary of Defense and the CIA, or the NID, the director of NID, the NID, work that out on a common basis. You remember when George Tenet was testifying before the 9/11 Commission, and he was asked about his relationship with Rumsfeld, the Secretary Rumsfeld, and the answer was, well, it's terrific, you know. I mean, and things in Washington do depend upon relationships as well as laws or executive orders or whatever. The problem was, I think we all a little bit had the feeling at that time that Director Tenet wasn't going to be around a great deal of time, so his answer didn't make much difference, that he got along well with the Secretary of Defense. Now, you can do this whole cloth. You can NID it and give absolute budget authority, period. You can do it in a partial manner, that you can share on NSA, NRO, geospatial, et cetera. But if you do that, you've already changed the game. And in a town where rules are rules, what Carter said to you was just fascinating. Joe Lieberman and I were whispering about it. It was fascinating that he said, go ahead and do this. Go ahead and do this. Run the intelligence community. And then if there are problems, we will work them out. I think that was then, this is now. As Senator Lieberman said, intelligence is now the tip of the spear. It comes first. It comes before warfighting, unless it's a sneak attack. And then it still comes before warfighting because it is meant to anticipate that. My question is this just a kind of a traditional fight in Washington where the Secretary of Defense has what the Secretary of Defense has, and the CIA is tasked to do three different things, can only do one of them, in fact? Well, he has a relationship with the President, or she has a relationship with the President. But it's not clean, it's not clear. So I'm saying, is this... Some people give up on this legislation, on the 9/11 Commission legislation, because they say it'll never work. One of you said it a moment ago. Because it won't happen. Congress won't pass it. The city won't allow it. The cultures won't allow it. I want to hear that I'm wrong on that, but I'd like your views.
I'm a military professional. And I think I understand the military's obsession here with being sure they have access to the best intelligence. Every military commander wants every asset under his control that he needs or she needs to prosecute whatever assignment he or she is given. It's a natural tendency. I keep coming back to that is not the primary priority for the country today. But we do want to have a system that ensures that military commander gets the best support we can possibly afford to give within the limits of also putting number one priority on terrorism. And I don't know that you can write that into a law. I think that's got to be ironed out by presidents and secretaries of defense and national intelligence directors as to how they balance that out individually. but the overall national interest is to err on the side of giving the National Intelligence Director more authority rather than less.
So you would come down on the idea of doing something about it in law rather than depend upon the well-meaning nature of those who protect us.
There are well-meaning people in our government in all levels, but the bureaucracies tend to keep them from doing well-meaning things frequently.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Senator Rockefeller, you may be right. The personalities involved here may be one issue, but I've known reasonably well every Secretary of Defense since Mel Laird, and none of them is a Casper milquetoast. The job tends to attract reasonably strong-willed people, and understandably so. I think there are three issues for the NID, and I haven't looked into which of these needs to be sorted out in legislation and which could be done by, let's say, report language, which suggests an executive order working with the White House, whatever. But it seems to me there are three issues. One is tasking. One is the power of appointment over the defense agencies, such as a director of NSA. And the third is budget execution. Now, I think with respect to tasking, the NID needs to exercise more authority than he or she now does, than the DCI now does. We need to move toward this business of taking consumers, intelligence consumers' judgments into account much more than just having these individual agencies that have these individual collection assets decide what to do with them. I think that's the first thing. How that's accomplished, how the NID is given that higher degree of authority, I haven't made a careful enough study to know. With respect to appointment, I believe that it would be a major step up over what the DCI now has for the NID to be given joint appointment authority with the Secretary of Defense for, let's say, the director of NSA or the director of the NRO. Not all of these service appointments, and perhaps not DIA, but I think that would work. With respect to budget execution, exactly where the appropriation goes, whether it goes to the Secretary of Defense or the NID, I think is less important than the fact that the NID needs more authority than the DCI now has over moving money around, reprogramming, and so forth. But I think Congresswoman Harman's position is the correct one, that the Secretary of Defense needs some type of outlet there. He needs a reclama. He needs the ability to say, we're moving, the NID has moved too much away from this data link that is vital to our combatant forces in such and such a place, and if they can't work it out, the President needs to decide it. So I think that is a reasonable increase in authority over what the DCI now has in those three areas, but I don't have any good suggestion to the committee about what parts of those need to be done by legislation and what parts can be accomplished elsewhere, otherwise.
I made reference at the beginning of my statement, of my testimony, to Professor Darling's rather thick and fulsome account of the first 5 years. Interesting that this issue that you're asking about now, he defined as how it raged before President Truman finally decided it. I would make a plea on the side of shifting the presumptions so that the NID is presumed to have the authority, and the burden is on those who want to dispute it to make the effort. The same thing follows from having a role in selecting the key people in the intelligence community. And I would like to see performance review done by the NID, because in some quarters, whoever writes the report card is the one who gets the attention. Just to shift that burden of the presumption of where the authority is, and then let the others come to legitimately question it, because these are human beings we're talking about.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Senator Voinovich.
Again, thank you for your service to our country, and thank you for being here today. It's interesting that there's a consensus among you. Mr. Woolsey, you were talking about the fact that we have secular Baathists, we have Shiites, we have Islamic Sunni. I like to refer to this as the Fourth World War. We had the Third World War was the Cold War, and this is the Fourth World War. And I think it's really important for us to understand that this is a different kind of war than we've ever encountered before in this nation's history. Would you agree to that? This is a different type of war that we're not accustomed to?
Very different in many ways. It has some more parallels to the Cold War, I think, Senator, than it does toward World War I or World War II, because we fought sometimes in the Cold War, but not the whole time. And in the Cold War, eventually, ideology turned out to be extremely important. We won in no small measure because we convinced people like Lech Walesa and Václav Havel and Andrei Sakharov that we were on the same side. We have to do that with hundreds of millions of good and decent Muslims in the world, I think.
So the issue of intelligence, and I would also say diplomacy, has become a lot more paramount in terms of dealing with this Fourth World War that we are finding ourselves. Would you agree with that?
In a lot of ways. Diplomacy of a very difficult sort, more difficult in a way than it was during the Cold War.
I'd like to get to the issue of the authority of the NID. And Mr. Woolsey, you were saying that you thought that the issue of the appointments, NSA and others, these departments, should be a shared responsibility. From who's going to be held responsible for the NSA? Is it the Secretary of Defense? Would the NID go to the Secretary of Defense and say, whoever it is you got over there is not getting the job done? Who's going to be? Someone mentioned that the performance evaluation ought to be done by the NID, but
this is a somewhat complex idea, but I'd have to say that my experience was one of very close collaboration with the Defense Department, and I think an NID and a Secretary of Defense could work this out. I think both should probably write performance evaluations. I think if either wants the individual dismissed, they would go to the president. It would be a presidential appointment in many cases anyway. And that ought to, it would produce perhaps a conflict and a disagreement, which the president would have to determine. But the way the situation works now for, say, the director of NSA is that the Secretary of Defense really does the appointment, and if the DCI has some reason to object, and normally they're not going to because this is a career military officer that probably they haven't known or worked with before, the DCI can object. But in fact, the director of NSA believes that he reports to the Secretary of Defense. And that needs to get adjusted in a way so that the NID, the head of the intelligence community, has something on the order of half the responsibility and authority over the director of NSA. Exactly how to arrange that, I know it's a somewhat different concept, but it seems to me to reflect reality much better than having the DNI or NID have full authority over the director of NSA, since a huge share of what NSA does is work for battlefield commanders.
The issue of the budget. Would they work out the budget issue too? In other words, you've got the NID looks at the whole area of the smorgasbord of intelligence and says, we're going to rearrange the way these things are being funded, and ends up having a battle with the Secretary of Defense over the amount of resources that they're going to be put in there.
In the executive branch, you're always working on 3 budgets simultaneously. You're working on the one you're putting together to submit to OMB in the fall. You're working on the one that Congress is holding hearings now on, and you're working on the one that you are executing. The DCI under the current system has some substantial authority, at least in theory, over what is being put together and submitted. But in practical terms, since he has so little real power outside the CIA, he's sometimes listened to, can sometimes influence what goes on. And as I said, the way I did this is I had this cap made up that said chairman, and when the Secretary of Defense or the Deputy Secretary of Defense and I would co-chair meetings, we would just, if we thought we were going to have a disagreement, we'd step out and resolve it. We kept the hat between us most of the time and worked on these things together.
But you would give the power on this, under this reorganization in terms of the budget and understanding that their interpersonal relationships would have something to do with how it finally got worked out.
Theoretically, I had more power with respect to the budget being assembled, and he had more power with respect to the budget that was being executed. In the real world, the DCI has rather little power over money as a whole outside the CIA. I think the NID needs a bit of a leg
The NID
up.
and the budgetary process would be working with OMB and say, hey, this is what I need to do to get the job done. So you'd think it'd be given a higher priority than it might under the current situation, or should be given it.
Yes. This gets very involved in the way the classified budget is put together. Back in the mid-'90s, during my tenure, there was not a so-called pass-back back to the intelligence community. The money all went back to the Defense Department, and frankly, I preferred it that way because I thought I would be hit with much deeper cuts if the intelligence budget was separate. I regarded the defense budget in those times as something of a sanctuary that would require that I be cut less than the big cuts I was already seeing. So during my tenure, I was delighted to be under the envelope of defense with respect to dealing with OMB, because I thought, and I think I was right, I would have gotten fewer cuts as part of the defense budget.
Under the new setup, if we agree that we have the Fourth World War is different than the Third World War, okay, or First or Second World War, it seems to be an allocation of resources that you may bump into the typical lobbying that's done in the Defense Department for hardware and all the other stuff that's supported by every lobbyist in this country, that every defense manufacturer. And it seems to me that if we're going to have the money to get the job done in the diplomacy and an intelligence area, we may have to cut back on some of the other things that we have been supporting here that seem to be, sacrosanct if we're going to be responsible in terms of these resources. What's your comment on that?
Well, Senator, the way I see it, in the early 1960s in the Kennedy administration, before Vietnam, the country was spending about 9% of GDP on defense and intelligence together. That would be the equivalent today of an approximately $1 trillion defense and intelligence budget, on the order of double what we're spending now. Now, admittedly, in those days, old people were not taken care of through government funding, through Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera, and so that part of the domestic part of the government has grown. But that's a decision within society about whether to take care of old people in their own homes or through the government. As far as resources allocated to national security, we're at about half the level of burden today that we were during the Kennedy administration. And look, I'm an old Scoop Jackson Democrat. I don't mind spending money. I think it's fine for us to fund whatever we need, indeed imperative to fund whatever we need on national security, and we ought to do some decent things on the domestic side too, and I'm willing to pay the taxes to do it. So anyway, for better or for worse, those would be my judgments.
Mr. Admiral or Mr. Webb, do you want to comment on it?
I can't comment on that. I think I agree. But the one thing I'd like to mention, because it hasn't been heard, is the problem today in reprogramming is enormous. Under existing authorities, it takes about 5 months to move money around in the intelligence community.
No comment.
Thank you.
Senator Levin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to just pick up where Senator Voinovich left off relative to the budget, first of all. Under the current law, as I read it, the power to develop and present the annual budget to the President is in the DCI. So already the DCI does the developing and presenting of the budget under the existing law. That would not change, presumably, under the proposal of the 9/11 Commission, except that there would be a new DNI. But putting that aside. Secondly, the issue then becomes into supervising the execution of the defense budget. That's where the issue, it seems, becomes the real one. And currently, that supervising of the execution of that budget rests basically in the Defense Department. However, under the Carter administration, as I understand you, Admiral Turner, that was with the DCI rather than the Defense Department. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Which means with the stroke of a pen, an executive pen, an executive order, that shift could go back to the DCI, and that does not require legislation. Would that be correct, Admiral?
I believe so, yes, sir.
Because we have to sort out what requires legislation and what can be done by executive order, and that's a very key issue because the difference in terms of execution of the budget, which includes reprogramming, is one which can be addressed by executive order clearly and doesn't need to be addressed through legislation because history has shown that it's been addressed through executive order rather than legislation. Now, in terms of the intelligence failures, well, would you all agree with that, what Admiral Turner just said?
Senator Levin, I haven't made a
I'm not talking about wisdom. I'm talking about whether that can be done that
Well,
way.
I haven't made a study of whether that can be done by executive order or would require legislation. This is in kind of the arcana of budget execution. It certainly, in my time, was in the hands of the Defense Department. And also, Congresswoman Harmon's bill, I think, may leave some aspect of execution authority in the hands of the Secretary of Defense, but give the NID a lot more authority over reprogramming. These are just details of the way this works that I'm a bit stale on.
All right, but these are critical issues. Do you know, Judge, would you agree with Admiral Turner or not on that?
That an executive order can do it?
Can go back to the Carter approach in terms of budget execution, which was an executive order approach. If you don't have an opinion, that's fine.
I don't have an opinion.
All right. Now, the question of execution of budget authority has been raised, and it's an important one, obviously, for us. The question, in my mind, is what is the relationship between that location of budget authority execution and the intelligence failures before 9/11 and before Iraq? We had major intelligence failures prior to 9/11, prior to Iraq. The reports of the Intelligence Committee in the Senate showed that. The Joint Intelligence Committees of the House and Senate report showed that, and surely the 9/11 Committee report showed that. Now, what is the relationship? Do you have examples, for instance, from your experience, of where the issue of where budget execution made a significant difference? Because I don't see it in the report. I don't see in the report how the issue over budget execution relates to the failures which were so dramatically laid out by the 9/11 Commission. Can you help us on that? Judge Webster, we'll start with you and go down the line.
I think you're correct, Senator. In broad generalities, what the 9/11 report says is that agencies were going their own way and information was not finding itself into a place where the warning and the danger would be clear. The conclusion of the report was that the leader of the intelligence community should be held responsible and given the authorities to make sure that did not happen again. Now, that's broadly stated. So I think that's really the connection. And he needs to have the authorities as well as be called the leader.
Then after 9/11, we created the Terrorist Threat Integration Center, where presumably we brought together all of the intelligence. so that we didn't have intelligence that wasn't shared and we could connect the dots. But my question is, and I think that's an important change, and I'm not sure that this new center which is being proposed, the counter-terrorist center, does much different in terms of coordination than what we've already done with TTIC, except for these additional authorities which are handed to the center. But my question is the budget execution issue. Do you see any relationship between where that was located prior to 9/11 or prior to Iraq and the failures of intelligence prior to 9/11 and prior to Iraq? Mr. Woolsey?
I don't really see that there is a substantial relationship, Senator Levin. There were failures within the foreign intelligence community, but I don't see those as principally having been communication between elements in the foreign intelligence community. Some were, but most were not. Most of the failures were legal limitations, such as Rule 6E of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure that prohibited the FBI, if they'd obtained material pursuant to grand jury subpoena, from sharing it with the intelligence community. There were policy limitations, some within the Justice Department. They were policies that had been adopted, for example, in late '95, and I hesitate to say I don't hesitate, I stress that I resigned in early '95, out in the CIA to limit the ability to penetrate groups by recruiting people with violence in their background. There were a lot of things, FAA policies about cooperating with hijackers. There were a lot of things that contributed to this, but I don't see that the heart of the matter is this budget execution authority vis-a-vis defense and DCI now, or perhaps an NID in the future.
Could I interrupt you there, because
yes.
I've got to get to Admiral Stan Turner, and then I want to just, do you have anything more to add on that, Admiral?
Very quickly, I think there is a connection, Senator.
Okay.
We're now saying we didn't have enough UMINT. What's one of the reasons we failed here? Well, if the NID has a budget execution authority, he or she could move money into UMINT or SIGINT or
Was there an
wherever
effort to do that which was thwarted?
I don't know.
All right. Final question. And I think, Judge, you've commented on this issue. The 9/11 Commission recommends establishing the intelligence director in the executive office of the President. My own concern about that is that the individual then would be so close to the President and his policy advisors that it could make it even more difficult for the National Intelligence Director to be independent of the policy pressures of the White House, thus increasing the risk of intelligence being shaped to support policy, as appears to have been done prior to the war in Iraq, rather than keeping the intelligence objective and independent. And also, and this part has not been really discussed publicly as much, which is that it might make it more likely for executive privilege to be invoked or suggested, thus making effective congressional oversight more difficult. Now, Judge, you've commented on this issue in your testimony, and you've indicated that you believe that it is important, in order to avoid the reality or the perception of intelligence being framed, read, spun, to support a foreign policy of the administration, that position be outside of the executive office of the President. I need a quick answer from the other two witnesses. Do you believe that the National Intelligence Director should be inside or outside of the executive office of the President? Mr. Woolsey, inside or outside? Because I'm out of time.
I think the key thing is that they report to the President. I care much less about whether they're inside or outside the executive office than it'd be an individual who is willing to be the skunk at the garden party.
Thank you.
I agree wholly with Jim.
Yeah, thank you both. They're very helpful answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Coleman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, gentlemen. Extraordinary testimony, and thank you for your service to our country. Director Woolsey, you raised an issue about the focus of this report, and the reason I want to raise this is whatever we do, whatever we put in place now has to suffice not just to respond to what happened yesterday, but what may happen tomorrow. It's kind of an obvious, like you take a poll and you're always getting somebody's opinion on yesterday, and yet the issue may be tomorrow. We know that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, has missile capacity. We know that have deep concerns about Iranians and developing nuclear capacity and what they will do with that. We have deep concerns about Syria and funding terrorism. And so my concern is, as we look at this report and we look at the concept of a national intelligence director, we look at the counterterrorism center, and I will quote a comment that appeared in a series of thoughts in the August 1st edition of the Washington Post, asking a number of folks, I think Admiral Turner, you responded to this, for their reflections on, where do we go with the report. This comment came from John Deutsch, former director of Central Intelligence from 95 to 96. He noted that, moreover, the proposal for a civilian-led unified joint command for counterterrorism works better for counterterrorism than for managing intelligence regarding other security issues that may arise in the Taiwan Straits, in the Palestine-Israel conflict, or the Indian subcontinent. So my question becomes for all of you, gentlemen, the structures that we're talking about now that are reflected in this Commission report, National Intelligence Director, a Joint Counterterrorism Center, does this structure, do you have a sense of confidence that it relates to some of the other concerns about terrorism, some of the other concerns about Hezbollah, about Iran, about Syria? That would be one question. And the second, if there are some, if not, if we're missing something, in this report and these recommendations to deal with those emerging issues, what would it be? Admiral Webster? Excuse me, Judge Webster.
Thank you. I'm never more than lieutenant senior grade, sir. The intelligence community leader has as his responsibility knowing what problems there are in the world, not just what is on the mind of a department head or seems to be for the moment a particular problem. And strategically, what problems are out there? I mentioned have and have not countries create wars. They need to be on the alert for that. And we shouldn't give up that responsibility because of the inadequacy of the authority of the community leader. That's my first point on that. Maybe I can come back.
Director Woolsey.
Senator Coleman, I'd say that, yes, tomorrow's threats may be very unlike this one. We could have a crisis in the Taiwan Straits and be looking at a serious confrontation with China, for example. And we don't want to structure our intelligence in such a way that the Secretary of Defense's ability to have a major hand in our intelligence resources is taken away. I don't think the Secretary of Defense is the main enemy here as we try to figure out what went wrong and before 9/11 and fix it. And I also think that the Commission's report, in its recommendations and really in its discussion, it has almost nothing to say about threats like Hezbollah and Iran and Syria. That wasn't its focus. Its focus was al-Qaeda's attack 9/11. And I think we want to be very careful that we not structure the intelligence community and these reforms in such a way as to fight only that war. We have a lot of worldwide responsibilities, and the Department of Defense is a major player in how we respond.
My hope would be, and that's my concern, Chairman Roberts talked about wanting to make sure we didn't do something that had unintended consequences. There are other threats out there, and I think, Director Wills, you said you've been through 5 of these kind of commissions. God forbid something terrible happens, there's going to be a 6th or 7th commission. So if there's something that as we look to the future, that we do here that you think would limit our ability to deal with those responses, I would hope that you would bring it to our attention and put it in the record. Admiral Turner?
I'm a little concerned, Senator, at the diagram I see in the report here where on the one hand, we have a National Counterintelligence Counterterrorism Center, and then down at the bottom right-hand corner of the chart, we have a whole group of individual threat centers, or I forget the exact title of them, and I worry that we're going to find that those are the only places we're focusing our intelligence effort, and there will be another one developed that we haven't thought of. I'm nervous about this. I haven't fully understood those charts.
I share your nervousness. One of the issues, other issues that I've raised in the past, being a former chief executive and mayor, you want and you need that skunk at the party. You need some dissenting voices. Is it your sense, and I appreciate all your response, that the structure that's being proposed here with the National Intelligence Director and then with the Counterterrorism Center that we have, is that going to allow for dissenting voices to get to the President, to get to the Commander-in-Chief? Director Woolsey.
Senator Coleman, I think that is largely a matter of individual propensity. I've known the men on my right and left for many years, each of them, and they both call it absolutely straight. I don't think when they were in the job or now or ever they have been in a position of trying to tell people on something important what they want to hear. And I think that comes down not so much to the organizational relationship, even whether somebody's in the cabinet, although I generally agree with Bill on keeping the NID out of the cabinet. I think the key thing is the individual. You have to have people who don't want too much to be liked.
Admiral Turner?
I would agree with Jim on that very much.
Judge Webster?
I agree.
The question about the relationship with the President, we've had discussion. I take it to all you gentlemen agree that this position should not be in the Cabinet. I think Judge Webster said that.
Yes.
Admiral Turner is shaking his head. How do we, help me understand how we structure this? There's been some discussion whether it's in the office or not. The bottom line is that the ability to do the job depends on the confidence of the President. I take it we all agree with that. Any disagreement with that?
Agreed.
So this issue of having terms beyond the President's term, I think, from my perspective, would not be a good idea if your power is going to depend on the relationship with the President. Can we structure that, or is it this is something that we have to leave to we elect a President and they're going to lead us in a direction? Director Woolsey, perhaps in a direction that you, as head of intelligence, say we shouldn't go, but our country is going to go with where the President says we go. Is this something that we can structure, or we simply have to leave it to the kind of not about the whims, but the realities of human relationships and strength coming from that relationship?
I think there's no guarantee, Senator Coleman, and I think there shouldn't be any greater difficulty in having an NID who is willing to speak independently and to reflect his analyst's views and his own views than there is for having a DCI. And generally over the years, DCIs have, I think, called it pretty straight, sometimes to the extent of not pleasing the boss. But I don't see how these changes make that problem any harder than it is now.
No, I agree. I think anything you can do, anything that in the culture that gives the leadership in the intelligence community the intellectual independence to call it the way it is seen by the experts and the analysts, setting forth alternative points of view if necessary. Their job is not to influence a policy or to make a policy happen. And again, I repeated to everyone, said it publicly, said it to the cabinet, we will do our very best to give you the best intelligence and analysis of that intelligence that we can have. Then it's up to you. You can use it, you can ignore it, you can tear it up and throw it away. The one thing you cannot do or ask us to do is change it. And I think we've held to that. And then the job of defining the policy that flows from that is up to other people.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Durbin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I suppose the questions I'm about to ask reflect the fact that I've taken a lot more history courses than management courses, but I hope you'll bear with me. There's a legendary saloon keeper in Chicago named Patty Baller. He ran an old saloon and was kind of a ward boss, and so they had a reform candidate running against him. And they went up to Patty Baller and he said, what do you think about this guy running against you? And he says, this city ain't ready for reform. He was right. The question is whether the intelligence community is ready for reform. And the 9/11 Commission, I think, has shaken us up, and they should. They did a great job, did great service to this country. But if we are often accused of being guilty of fighting the last war, it appears that in the case for reforming the intelligence community, we are basing it on the second last war. Because since 9/11, we've had another historic event occur, and that was the invasion of Iraq. And the invasion of Iraq, I think, made it clear to us in 2002, after, I should say, our vote in 2002, our invasion in 2003, that intelligence failed us a second time. I wonder what a commission, an Iraq Invasion Intelligence Commission, what their recommendations might be a year later after 9/11. Would they be any different? Certainly, I think it calls into question whether there's any power of self-healing within the intelligence community. We failed on 9/11. The intelligence community didn't do as good a job as it should have done. A year later, they were tested again. And by the report of the Senate Intelligence Committee, they failed again. On 9/11, they had to look at the whole world and figure out who our enemy was, and they didn't get it. They didn't get it right. When it came to the invasion of Iraq, they had to look at one country and figure out what the danger was. And they didn't get that right either. Which brings me to this point, and that is whether or not when we talk about this reform process here, whether changing nameplates and changing email addresses is really getting to the heart of the problem. Judge Webster, 13-year-old mainframes at the FBI have been screaming bloody murder about this for 3 years. Why don't we have a Manhattan Project on intelligence technology? Why aren't we gathering the best and brightest in the academic and the private sector and the public sector, breaking through all of the federal red tape and building a computer system to fight the war on terror? We haven't even decided to try that yet. And yet we're talking about moving nameplates and who has budgetary authority and whether they're going to be part of the cabinet. Secondly, Mr. Woolsey, thanks for joining us again. I still am troubled by your repeated comments at these hearings that it sometimes isn't safe for these agencies to share information. There may just be another spy in one of these agencies, you said. How are you going to get trusted communication that the 9/11 Commission calls for if you start with that premise? If it isn't safe for the FAA to tell the FBI about dangerous people, if it isn't safe for the border crossing guards to take fingerprints and share them with the FBI. So my point is this, going back to history as opposed to management, is the intelligence community ready for reform? If it isn't ready for reform, are we kidding ourselves here? Are we going through a political exercise, moving nameplates around, that really won't achieve the fundamental reform that Admiral Turner referred to when the President of the United States called him in and said, we're going to do it differently, and you're in charge of doing it differently? That's what bothers me. Jump ball. Anybody like to comment?
Well, Senator Durbin, 2 points. First of all, about pre-Iraq and a commission on that. In a sense, there is one. The commission on the WMD estimates, co-chaired, I believe, by former Senator Robb and Justice Judge Silverman, is holding hearings. I'm testifying before them, I think, next week on those issues, and it's a complicated set of issues, but nonetheless, just as there were about 5 post Pearl Harbor commissions, there will doubtless be more than one post 9/11 and post Iraq commissions. It seems to be kind of a constant here in Washington. I think on the sharing issue, the point I want to make is that the 9/11 Commission essentially said need to share should replace need to know. And it has a mechanism, a kind of an internet, a trusted information internet. My testimony is more thorough, my written testimony is more thorough than what I said here at the table on that point. But the key issue seems to me to be that we should not give up on need to know. We ought to try to continually adjust who needs to know what. We ought to make sure that a person, regardless of what agency they're in, if they're a DIA analyst and they're one of the 2 or 3 best people in government to look at a particular issue, they ought to be given access to a CIA Directorate of Operations Blue Border report, as long as they are trusted and security cleared and so forth. I'm not suggesting that we should stay within the stovepipes. It's the numbers that bother me. because insofar as one widely disseminates material, one could have a Robert Hansen who turned out to be a pretty clever computer
Woolsey,
operator.
Mr. Governor Keene and Congressman Hamilton sat in those chairs and told us, we've got to be more creative. We've got to be more imaginative. We can't keep putting things in these neat little drawers of expectations. We've got to think more broadly in a war on terrorism. And what you're arguing for, even though it may be stovepipes with a few holes in it, is to make sure that the holes are directed in the right ways. How do you get creativity and imagination out of that?
Well, you know, Senator, the victors in World War II used intelligence very creatively. And one way they did so, particularly with respect to the very sensitive signals intercepts and decrypting that we were doing of the Japanese codes and the British and Enigma were doing of the German codes, was radically to restrict the numbers of people who did the analysis and had exposure to those technologies, but to make them the very best. Now, whenever I see, as I saw back in 1998, headlines in the press saying, we are listening to bin Laden's satellite telephones, and we know immediately thereafter he stops using them.
That was a leaked story in the Washington Times, which killed a source for us.
It strikes me that once I see leaks like that, I think there are too many blabbermouths in the government who are being given access to signals intelligence. The person who leaked that, I think, has as much blood on his or her hands as anyone with respect to 9/11. And so it's impossible to always disseminate only to the right people. And I do think we need to disseminate across agency lines, but we also, I think, should not think that we're going to do something effective just by broadcasting and sharing very widely without attention to precisely whom this sharing is going to. That's my only point.
I have a few seconds left, but I really would like if either of the other two witnesses could comment, Madam Chair, on this whole question about whether or not we can create a climate of reform in agencies which don't appear to be open to that climate.
Senator, I tried to say in my comments that the biggest problem today is how we analyze these situations. Henry Kissinger has a piece in the Post today saying analysis, interpretation is the real problem here. Changing these boxes will help some, but it's not the solution. The solution is with you. Are you interrogating, I'm sorry, the intelligence committees?
I'm on that too.
Okay, sorry, sir. Are you interrogating these people when they come up and finding out if they really can back up what they're saying?
Admiral, we have 22 staff members on the Senate Intelligence Committee shared by the members for 15 different intelligence agencies. I think you can answer that question yourself. We can't get into the level of depth that we should with the current situation on Capitol Hill. The 9/11 Commission's right. We have failed in oversight. We have to accept some responsibility here.
And there's the PIFIAB, and there's the whole bureaucratic structure. I mean, is the Secretary of State asking these questions? Are the Secretaries of Defense asking these questions? We've just got to encourage a much more inquiring approach to intelligence.
Are we ready? I think we're always ready if a good reason is presented and a good objective is understood, and then people will go to work and find it. That's true in the FBI, it's true in the CIA, and it's true in the other elements of the intelligence community. But when we think about how intelligence is collected, as Admiral Turner pointed out, then we think, what do we do with that intelligence? Where does it go? Using my FBI example, there's an extraordinary amount of information that's in those files. Getting them out depends on how the architecture of the system. And the architecture of the system had something else in mind when it was created. I don't think it needs a Manhattan Project, but it sure needs some attention and a willingness to invest in what creates that capability to share, but share with protection.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Carper.
Senator Urban, who was the person in the saloon keeper in Chicago that you spoke of?
Patty Baller.
Patty Baller. And Patty Baller was the quote, the city ain't ready for reform. And one could also look at the intelligence community and conclude that given the unanimous recommendations of this 9/11 Commission, the Select Committee on Intelligence unanimous recommendations, the countless commissions that have existed over the last 30, 40 years recommending change, maybe the intelligence community ain't ready for reform either. I would go a bit further and say, my guess is that the committees on which we serve here in the Senate and in the House ain't ready for reform. You have testified over since, I guess, since the 1970s, some of you, before countless committees of the House and Senate. And you have a pretty good idea how this place works and sometimes doesn't work too well. And I'm not going to ask you to help us today think through how we may want to restructure our committees in the House or the Senate. But I do want to remind us all that in the 9/11 Commission report, while there's a whole lot of recommendations with respect to the changes in the executive branch, there are quite a few recommendations with respect to how we operate here on our side of this government. There's discussions and suggestions that we wait before we change our committee structure until we figure out how we're going to restructure the executive branch. Whether we're going to have this director of intelligence, whether we're going to, what kind of responsibilities we'll invest in that person. But let me just ask you this. Set aside what responsibilities we invest this director with respect to budget and personnel and so forth. Should we be thinking this year about making changes in our approach with respect to oversight, the number of committees that we have? I think with respect to the Department of Homeland Security alone, I heard as many as 80 committees and subcommittees that have some piece of jurisdiction over Homeland Security. What would be your recommendations with respect to sequencing for structural changes on the legislative side?
My view is it's all ought to go ahead concurrently. I don't see why changing the congressional structure needs wait until you decide whether it's a DCI or an NID. That isn't all that big a change, in my opinion. And in any event, your structure needs change just as the rest of it does, and we ought to get on with it. I happen to have been the DCI who had to be there when the committees got formed. Actually, not the Senate committee. I was 6 months late, but I was really the DCI who had to figure out how we adjusted to dealing with the Congress, because we had almost no contact, I believe, before that. And I must say that in looking back on it, I'm disappointed in the Congress's performance over these many years. The things that have got by, like Watergate and so on, Iran-Contra, I meant. So I think it's really time for an introspection by the Congress, and I think your role is so vital here in trying, with limitations of the size of your staffs and all that, to introduce a real inquisitiveness into this situation as to whether they are looking at all the aspects of it and not getting group-thinked.
Thank you, Randall.
Senator, when we talk about completing the dots, what about those 80 committees? How many dots fail to get completed because of a spread in responsibility and authority throughout the Congress? How much better it might have been if this committee or the SSCI had full knowledge of all the regulation that was going on. It's an argument for consolidation, just as we're hearing that intelligence needs to consolidate and control its information.
Thank you. Mr. Woolsey?
Senator, I come at this from a particular perspective. In the early 70s, while I was still in my 20s, I was general counsel of the Senate Armed Services Committee for Senator Stennis. And one other staff member and I, together with one appropriations staffer, were the three cleared staffers in the Senate that worked on the intelligence budget. And among other things, we all had other duties as well. When I returned some 20 years later as DCI to testify before the Congress on intelligence and realized I was dealing with 4 committees, a substantial number of staffers. For example, one of my several of my many trips to Capitol Hill in 1993 were to try to turn around the decision of the Senate Select Committee's expert on satellite design, because he had a different idea about the way satellites should be designed than our experts in the National Reconnaissance Office. I came to the view that some consolidation with respect to oversight on Capitol Hill would be a pretty good idea, and I'm pleased that the Commission recommended it. I think far and away the best approach would be a single committee, a joint committee along the lines of the old Joint Atomic Energy Committee. I don't think that the appropriations process, at least in my experience, is broken, and I don't see anything particularly necessary to fix it. But I think the biggest problem is the time limitation, the term limitation on the members of the House and Senate Select Committees, because it really helps a lot to have people on the members of the committees who've seen issues come around again and again. They can provide an institutional memory the way the members of a number of other congressional committees do, rather than having to be educated afresh with respect to what this satellite does or that NSA program does every time one comes before them. So I do think getting rid of term limits, hopefully having a single committee for authorization would be very positive steps, and like Stan and Bill, I don't think it needs to await whether you have an NID or a DCI.
Good, thanks. I would just say to you, Madam Chair, and to my friend and colleague, Senator Lieberman, this has been an extraordinary panel. And I've sat here, I've learned a lot, but I've also been struck by how fortunate we are as Americans that each of you have served our country and still do. And make me proud, and I'm sure I speak for all of us in saying that. Let me just ask in my last question. One of the values of having a diverse panel like this, but people with rich experience, is to share with us at sort of at the end of the hearing that on the big pieces, the big recommendations, where do you agree? Where do you see the consensus? Because we can go in a million different directions coming out of here, out of these hearings, but where do you see consensus among yourselves that would urgently urge us to pursue?
I think it's empowering somebody to run a $40 billion a year, roughly, operation. And we just don't have that, and we need to have a CEO. So the real issue is just how much authority you give that CEO and still protect the Department of Defense. And I, as a military officer, would err on the side of giving it to the National Intelligence Director.
And I, as a lawyer, now a management consultant, who only spent 2 years in the uniformed military, would err a little bit more on the side of protecting the interests of the Secretary of Defense. But generally speaking, I think Stan and Bill and I are headed in the same direction. And I would agree with establishing an NID. I would agree with enhancing their authority over tasking, budget, and personnel, but I would like to essentially require a collaborative relationship between that individual and the Secretary of Defense over that some 80% of the national intelligence programs.
Thank you. Judge?
I haven't much to add except that giving the intelligence leader, whatever he may turn out to be, the kind of authorities that he's thought to have but really doesn't, and making them work in that way as Jim called it an adjustment. I'd say shifting the initiative, the presumption of authority, all of those things can only work for a more effective intelligence community.
Thanks. That was great.
Could I add one point? I don't worry about the Defense Department so much because it's so powerful. I mean, it's got all kinds of ways of protecting its interests and will.
Thank you. Thanks for that clarification and for your excellent testimony.
Thank you, Senator. And last but not least, the ever-patient senator from Minnesota, Senator Dayton.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman.
Staying.
I moved from 100th in seniority to 89th, and I'm not always clear to me, exactly what difference that makes in the scheme of things. Except I guess I get to be in the same time zone as the chairman, as opposed to off the deep end here. But it's been an excellent hearing too. I would say the same thing. And very, very worthwhile. Thank you all three for your service and also your expertise here. To paraphrase, Senator Ben Nelson in the Senate, if it hasn't been asked by everyone, it hasn't been asked. But I'm not sure what's really left here. We talked a lot at the top of the organizations. What about in the midsections and so forth? Is these various 8 entities under the Department of Defense, each branch, Marines, Air Force, Navy, Army has its own separate intelligence. Are we making more of this 15 different entities or agencies dispersion than it really involves? Or are we talking about very separate entities here that ought to be consolidated, merged in order to be more efficient?
20 years ago, I wrote a piece in the Washington Post that recommended removing Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps and Coast Guard from the intelligence community, national intelligence community. Their job is tactical. And Navy intelligence, for instance, doesn't need to inform the Chief of the Navy about the strategic picture, what's going on in the rest of the world. He's got the Defense Intelligence Agency that can provide all that to them. And I think we ought to hive them off and put them into the tactical field. Let them know that that's where they stay. They shouldn't be bothering to study the strategic picture. Anyway, we've got too much duplication there.
Sir?
I think over the years, at least up until the time I was, as of the time I was DCI 9 years ago, the roles and functions of the military service intelligence operations have shrunk and consolidated, and I think although their membership on some bodies may be a bit out of date, their real function and what they really spend their time on is material that's directly and immediately relevant to their own service. And also I think that people add up all the numbers, but the State Department Bureau of Intelligence and Research generally does a good job. It's 100 or so analysts working for the Secretary of State. There are several of these agencies that are not large and I think don't create any particular problem or confusion. The big ones with respect to money, other than the CIA, are the National Security Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, the National Geospatial Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. And each of those has an important function. It's not going to be that hard for an NID to deconflict them. I don't think it's necessary to have any massive reform of them. I think there are some adjustments and changes that can be made, and I think an NID working with a Secretary of Defense can do it. To my mind, the hard problem here is melding domestic and foreign intelligence on the terrorist threat. That's new, it's tough. It gets into civil liberties issues, or issues sometimes are real civil liberties issues, sometimes ones that are perceived to be such. It's, to my mind, that is why we need to move to an NID so he or she can coordinate and pull together what's happening domestically with respect to terrorist groups, embassies here that might directly or indirectly help fund terrorist-friendly groups and so on the one hand, and foreign intelligence about what's going on overseas on the other. It's the foreign domestic lash-up that seems to me to be right at the heart of the new NID's job, and it's one of the reasons why I keep coming back to the fact that I don't think the Secretary of Defense is the main problem here. I think we just ought to work something that the Defense Department can live with, and that's going to work. It works reasonably well now. The problem, I think, the big problem is in this new world of having to look at foreign and domestic together.
The 4 entities you mentioned, other than the CIA, are within the Department of Defense. So you've got those 4 entities, and then you've got the CIA, and then you have if you take the domestic side, I assume you're talking about primarily the FBI or some of these others here. Again, we've got Homeland Security, Treasury, Energy. I mean, again, who are
most of
who
those
are the big entities here? Are we talking about FBI, CIA, Department of Defense, and these four subsidiaries under theirs? Going back to your management expertise, how do you pull this together? How do you have somebody who's NID who's then directing four subsidiaries under the Secretary of Defense?
Well, they have different functions. The NRO designs, launches, and operates the satellites. The National Geospatial Agency takes that data and makes maps and photos and integrates it gets it to the combatant forces. NSA does signals intercepts and decryption. There are areas where they need to work together, but it's not as if you have a lot of people actually doing the same thing.
But who do they report to? They were saying they report to the this new NID?
I
so
think
why are they in the Department of Defense?
They have grown up. The NSA was originally a Defense Department agency. The National Reconnaissance Office for many years was, and still in a lot of ways is, a joint venture essentially between the CIA and the Department of Defense. The National Geospatial Agency grows out of a merger of the Defense Mapping Agency and the CIA people who were doing photo interpretation, and our successor, John Deutsch, made that a defense agency. And the Defense Intelligence Agency has grown up over time with varied jobs, but it's not really duplicative. For example, they manage the attachés. They run certain specialized collection operations with different types of aircraft and so forth. So these different agencies, the defense ones really report for all practical purposes to the Secretary of Defense, but the DCI under the current system can have some influence over the direction they go, but I think not enough to really pull them together in the way that you're suggesting they should be pulled together. I think the Secretary of Defense and the NID working together could get these rationalized fine. I don't think it's the major problem. I think the major problem is domestic and foreign pulling that together.
Is the way Admiral Turner described the arrangement under President Carter, is that going to do it here? Is that what we're talking about here, where that one person under fiat or whatever has that authority then, despite being out of the organizational chart loop, just is inserted and said, okay, you're going to run the show?
I think the big problem is not necessarily that one needs to move the budget execution authority. The big problem is that one needs to radically simplify and enhance the role of the DCI under the current system or the NID under a new one for reprogramming. I think Bill Webster was right on the money when he says, literally and figuratively, when he said it's almost impossible now, and there are massive delays involved in an NID or a DCI today, moving money from one of these programs to another. Secretary of Defense needs to be heard and be able to reclama that to the President if need be, but you need more ability to reprogram. That's the flexibility, I think, that an NID needs that a DCI doesn't really have.
Mr. Chairman, my time's up. Thank you very much. Excellent hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you all again.
Thank you. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. Each of you added a great deal to our consideration of these important issues. We have a heavy responsibility to produce a reform bill, to do so in a relatively short amount of time, and being able to call on people with your experience, expertise, and judgment certainly facilitates our task. I hope we can continue to call upon you during our deliberations, and I thank you very much for being here today. The hearing record will remain open for 5 days. I want to thank my colleagues also again for their efforts to be here. I think it's a sign not only of the compelling testimony that we have, but the importance of our task, that so many members have come back from their home states and have stayed throughout the hearing. So I thank you. Senator Lieberman, did you have any closing comments?
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Just to join you in thanking the three witnesses, this has been a very, very valuable hearing. We've actually learned something from you, and we appreciate it.
I find that less shocking than does my ranking member.
Well, it may comment more on other hearings than on you, but anyway, I appreciate it. When I called you three wise men at the beginning, you haven't let us down. And I think it's very important that the three of you have in different ways said that the status quo is not acceptable anymore with regard to the intelligence community. We're all for a stronger national intelligence director. There may be some disagreement about the details. Admiral Turner, your story from the Carter administration was fascinating to me, and it does show that what a lot of us are calling for could be done without statute change. On the other hand, the statute is permanent and does set a standard, so we need to act quickly. I'd say the final thing I'd say is that I agree with Mr. Woolsey that we've got to stop ever using the word czar to describe strengthening of position. And for the moment, I like your comment that the NID is meant to be a CEO, right? It's meant to be a chief executive officer. Thank you, and Madam Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Madam
Senator
Madam
Day.
Chairman, tomorrow morning, and I know you've made some considerable effort to reconcile your timetable with that of the other committee in which we both serve. What is your intention tomorrow with regard to the witnesses and proceedings? Because that next committee starts, I think it's an hour and 15 minutes later.
Which is highly unfortunate. Right. We had changed our hearing time twice to accommodate armed services, and then unfortunately the secretary had an appointment that he couldn't change. Our hearing will begin at 9 o'clock now, and I would encourage members who are on both committees to just go back and forth. We will be hearing from a very compelling panel of family witnesses of those who lost loved ones on 9/11. As you know, they were the driving force behind the creation of the commission, and they've followed its work very closely. So I think it's an important hearing. And but I certainly understand that members are going to have a lot of conflicts. But we will begin
which is why I regret that. I guess I just respectfully ask if we could, if they have that opportunity to have that panel begin its remarks as soon as is practical tomorrow morning. We'll accommodate those of us who do need to be at both simultaneously.
Exactly. That's why we moved it up to 9 o'clock too. Senator Voinovich.
Yep. We're talking about moving very quickly on this whole issue. The statistics that 195 days that the Congress was in session, and it was on the Hill, 205 of those days testifying begs, or
meetings, some of those were meetings.
Meetings begs for the fact that we ought to move as quickly as we possibly can to shape up our shop as we do the other. In other words, we ought to have this on both tracks, and I recommend to you and also to Senator Lieberman, our leadership, that they ought to get on with this whole issue, because we can't keep going the way we're going. I mean, this whole committee structure is not put together in a way to respond to the threats that we have today, and it's incumbent on us to get the job done.
I think you're absolutely right. Senator Lieberman and I have been assigned the reorganization of the executive branch, not the legislative branch, but I know that our Senate leaders are moving forward with that vital recommendation as well. And you're certainly correct that Mr. Woolsey's testimony about the number of commitments on the Hill that he had to answer, certainly, while oversight's very important, we ought to be able to do it in a more efficient manner so that we're not taking up all of the executive branch's time testifying before Congress. So thank you for those comments as well. Thank you. This hearing is adjourned.